My lady love, my dove. It's been my habit for many years to take a nap after lunch. I settle myself in a chair in the living room with a cushion behind my head and my feet up on a small square leather stool, and I read until I drop off. On this Friday afternoon I was in my chair and feeling as comfortable as ever with a book in my hands, an old favourite, Doubleday and Westwood's The Genera of Diurnal Lepidoptera, when my wife, who's never been a silent lady, began to talk to me from the sofa opposite. "These two people," she said. "What time are they coming?" I made no answer, so she repeated the question, louder this time. I told her politely that I didn't know. "I don't think I like them very much," she said, "especially him." "No, dear. All right." "Arthur, I said I don't think I like them very much." I lowered my book and looked across at her lying with her feet up on the sofa, flipping over the pages of some fashion magazine. "We've only met them once," I said. "A dreadful man, really. Never stopped telling jokes or stories or something." "I'm sure you'll manage them very well, dear." "And she's pretty frightful, too. When do you think they'll arrive?" "Somewhere around 6 o'clock, I guessed." "But don't you think they're awful?" she asked, pointing at me with her finger. "Well, they're too awful. They really are." "We can hardly put them off now, Pamela." "They're absolutely the end," she said. "Then why did you ask them?" The question slipped out before I could stop myself, and I regretted it at once, for it's a rule with me never to provoke my wife if I can help it. There was a pause, and I watched her face, waiting for the answer. The big, white face that to me was something so strange and fascinating. There were occasions when I could hardly bring myself to look away from it. In the evenings, sometimes, working on her embroidery, or painting those small, intricate flower pictures, the face would tighten and glimmer with a subtle inward strength that was beautiful beyond words, and I would sit and stare at it minute after minute while pretending to read. Even now, at this moment, with that compressed, acid look, the frowning forehead, the petulant curl of the nose, I had to admit there was a majestic quality about this woman, something splendid, almost stately. And so tall she was, far taller than I, although today, in her 51st year, I think one would have to call her big rather than tall. "You know very well why I asked them," she answered sharply. "For bridge, that's all. They play an absolutely first-class game, and for a decent stake." She glanced up and saw me watching her. "Well," she said, "that's about the way you feel too, isn't it?" "Well, of course, don't be a fool, Arthur. The only time I met them, I must say they did seem quite nice." "So is the butcher." "Now, Pamela, dear, please, we don't want any of that." "Listen," she said, slapping down the magazine on her lap. "You saw the sort of people they were as well as I did. A pair of stupid climbers who think they can go anywhere just because they play good bridge." "I'm sure you're right, dear, but what I don't honestly understand is why I keep telling you, so that for once we can get a decent game. I'm sick and tired of playing with rabbits, but I really can't see why I should have these awful people in the house." "Of course not, my dear, but isn't it a little late now?" "Arthur?" "Yes?" "Why, for God's sake, do you always argue with me? You know you dislike them as much as I did." "I really don't think you need worry, Pamela. After all, they seemed quite a nice, well-mannered young couple." "Arthur, don't be pompous." She was looking at me hard, with those wide grey eyes of hers, and to avoid them, they sometimes made me quite uncomfortable. I got up and walked over to the French windows that led into the garden. The big, sloping lawn out in front of the house was newly mown, striped with pale and dark ribbons of green. On the far side, The tulipburnums were in full flower at last, the long golden chains making a blaze of colour against the darker trees beyond. The roses were out too, and the scarlet begonias, and in the long herbaceous border all my lovely hybrid lupins, columbine, delphinium, sweet william, and the huge, pale, scented iris. One of the gardeners was coming up the drive from his lunch. I could see the roof of his cottage through the trees, and beyond it, to one side, the place where the drive went out through the iron gates on the Canterbury Road. My wife's house. Her garden. How beautiful it all was. How peaceful. Now, if only Pamela would try to be a little less solicitous of my welfare, less prone to coax me into doing things for my own good rather than for my own pleasure, then everything would be heaven. Mind you, I don't want to give the impression that I do not love her. I worship the very air she breathes, or that I can't manage her, or that I'm not the captain of my ship. All I'm trying to say is that she can be a trifle irritating at times, the way she carries on. For example, those little mannerisms of hers. I do wish she would drop them all, especially the way she has of pointing a finger at me to emphasize a phrase. You must remember that I'm a man who is built rather small, and a gesture like this, when used to excess by a person like my wife, is apt to intimidate. I sometimes find it difficult to convince myself that she's not an overbearing woman. "Arthur," she called, "come here." "What?" "I've just had a most marvellous idea. Come here." I turned and went over to where she was lying on the sofa. "Look," she said, "do you want to have some fun?" "What sort of fun?" "With the Snapes." "Who are the Snapes?" "Come on," she said, "wake up. Henry and Sally Snape, our weekend guests." "Well?" "Now listen. I was lying here thinking how awful they really are, the way they behave, him with his jokes and her like a sort of love-crazed sparrow." She hesitated, smiling slyly, and for some reason I got the impression she was about to say a shocking thing. "Well, if that's the way they behave when they're in front of us, then what on earth must they be like when they're alone together?" "Now, wait a minute, Pamela. Don't be an ass, Arthur. Let's have some fun, some real fun for once, tonight." She'd half raised herself up off the sofa, her face bright with a kind of sudden recklessness, the mouth slightly open, and she was looking at me with two round grey eyes, a spark dancing slowly in each. "Why shouldn't we?" "What do you want to do?" "Well, it's obvious, can't you see?" "No, I can't." "All we've got to do is put a microphone in their room." I admit I was expecting something pretty bad, but when she said this I was so shocked I didn't know what to answer. "That's exactly what we'll do," she said. "Here," I cried. "No, wait a minute. You can't do that." "Why not?" That's about the nastiest trick I've ever heard of. It's like... It's like listening at keyholes or reading letters, only far, far worse. You don't mean this seriously, do you?" "Of course I do." I knew how much she disliked being contradicted, but there were times when I felt it necessary to assert myself, even at considerable risk. "Pamela," I said, snapping the words out sharply, "I forbid you to do it." She took her feet down from the sofa and sat up straight. "What in God's name are you trying to pretend to be, Arthur? I simply don't understand you." "That shouldn't be too difficult." "Tommyrot! I've known you do lots of worse things than this before now." "Never." "Oh, yes, I have. What makes you suddenly think you're a so much nicer person than I am?" "I've never done things like that." "All right, my boy," she said, pointing her finger at me like a pistol. "What about the time at the Milfords last Christmas? Remember? You nearly laughed your head off, and I had to put my hand over your mouth to stop them hearing us. What about that for one? That was different, I said. It wasn't our house, and they weren't our guests. It doesn't make any difference at all. She was sitting very upright, staring at me with those round grey eyes, and the chin was beginning to come up high in a peculiarly contemptuous manner. "Don't be such a pompous hypocrite," she said. "What on earth's come over you?" I really think it's a pretty nasty thing, you know, Pamela. I honestly do. But listen, Arthur. I'm a nasty person, and so are you in a secret sort of way. That's why we get along together. Oh, I never heard such nonsense. Mind you, if you suddenly decided to change your character completely, that's another story. But you've got to stop talking this way, Pamela. You see, she said, if you really have decided to reform, then what on earth am I going to do? You don't know what you're saying. Arthur, how could a nice person like you want to associate with a stinker? I sat myself down slowly in the chair opposite her, and she was watching me all the time. You understand, she was a big woman with a big white face, and when she looked at me hard, as she was doing now, I became, how shall I say it, surrounded, almost enveloped by her, as though she were a great tub of cream and I had fallen in. You don't honestly want to do this microphone thing, do you? But of course I do. It's time we had a bit of fun round here. Come on, Arthur, don't be so stuffy. It's not right, Pamela. It's just as right, up came the finger again, just as right as when you found those letters of Mary Probert's in her purse, and you read them through from beginning to end. We should never have done that. We? You read them afterwards, Pamela. It didn't harm anyone at all. You said so yourself at the time, and this one's no worse. How would you like it if someone did it to you? How could I mind if I didn't know it was being done? Come on, Arthur, don't be so flabby. Well, I'll have to think about it. Maybe the great radio engineer doesn't know how to connect the mic to the speaker. Oh, that's the easiest part. Well, go on then. Go on and do it. I'll think about it, and I'll let you know later. There's no time for that. They might arrive any moment. Then I won't do it. I'm not going to be caught red-handed. If they come before you're through, I'll simply keep them down here. No danger. What's the time, anyway? It was nearly 3 o'clock. They're driving down from London, she said. And they certainly won't leave till after lunch. That gives you plenty of time. Which room are you putting them in? The big yellow room at the end of the corridor. That's not too far away, is it? Well, I suppose it could be done. And by the by, she said, where are you going to have the speaker? I haven't said I'm going to do it yet. My God, she cried. I'd like to see someone try and stop you now. You ought to see your face. It's all pink and excited at the very prospect. Put the speaker in our bedroom, why not? But go on, and hurry. I hesitated. It was something I made a point of doing whenever she tried to order me about it, instead of asking nicely, I don't like it, Pamela. She didn't say any more after that. She just sat there, absolutely still, watching me, a resigned, waiting expression on her face, as though she were in a long queue. This, I knew from experience, was a danger signal. She was like one of those bomb things with the pin pulled out, and it was only a matter of time before bang, and she would explode. In the silence that followed, I could almost hear her ticking. So I got up quietly and went out to the workshop and collected a mic and 150 feet of wire. Now that I was away from her, I'm ashamed to admit that I began to feel a bit of excitement myself. A tiny, warm, prickling sensation under the skin, near the tips of my fingers. It was nothing much, mind you, really nothing at all. Good heavens, I experienced the same thing every morning of my life when I opened the paper to check the closing prices on 2 or 3 of my wife's larger stock holdings. So I wasn't going to get carried away by a silly joke like this. At the same time, I couldn't help being amused. I took the stairs 2 at a time and entered the yellow room at the end of the passage. It had the clean, unlived-in appearance of all guest rooms, with its twin beds, yellow satin bedspreads, pale yellow walls, and golden-coloured curtains. I began to look around for a good place to hide the mic. This was the most important part of all, for whatever happened it must not be discovered. I thought first of the basket of logs by the fireplace. Put it under the logs. No, not safe enough. Behind the radiator. On top of the wardrobe. Under the desk. None of these seemed very professional to me. All might be subject to chance inspection because of a dropped collar stud or something like that. Finally, with considerable cunning, I decided to put it inside the springing of the sofa. The sofa was against the wall, near the edge of the carpet, and my lead wire could go straight under the carpet over to the door. I tipped up the sofa and slit the material underneath. Then I tied the microphone securely up among the springs, making sure that it faced the room. After that, I led the wire under the carpet to the door. I was calm and cautious in everything I did. Where the wire had to emerge from under the carpet and pass out of the door, I made a little groove in the wood so that it was almost invisible. All this, of course, took time, and when I suddenly heard the crunch of wheels on the gravel of the drive outside, and then the slamming of car doors and the voices of our guests, I was still only halfway down the corridor, tacking the wire along the skirting. I stopped and straightened up, hammer in hand, and I must confess I felt afraid. You've no idea how unnerving that noise was to me. I experienced the same sudden, stomachy feeling of fright as when a bomb once dropped the other side of the village during the war one afternoon while I was working quietly in the library with my butterflies. Don't worry, I told myself. Pamela will take care of these people. She won't let them come up here. Rather frantically, I set about finishing the job, and soon I had the wire tacked all along the corridor and through into our bedroom. Here concealment was not so important, although I still did not permit myself to get careless because of the servants. So I laid the wire under the carpet and brought it up unobtrusively into the back of the radio. Making the final connections was an elementary technical matter, and took me no time at all. Well, I had done it. I stepped back and glanced at the little radio. Somehow, now, it looked different. No longer a silly box for making noises, but an evil little creature that crouched on the tabletop with a part of its own body reaching out secretly into a forbidden place far away. I switched it on. It hummed faintly, but made no other sound. I took my bedside clock, which had a loud tick, and carried it along to the yellow room, and placed it on the floor by the sofa. When I returned, sure enough, the radio creature was ticking away as loudly as if the clock were in the room, even louder. I fetched back the clock, then I tidied myself up in the bathroom, returned my tools to the workshop, and prepared to meet the guests. But first, to compose myself, and so that I would not have to appear in front of them with the blood, as it were, still wet on my hands, I spent 5 minutes in the library with my collection. I concentrated on a tray of the lovely Vanessa Cardew, the Painted Lady, and made a few notes for a paper I was preparing entitled The Relation Between Colour Pattern and Framework of Wings, which I intended to read at the next meeting of our society in Canterbury. In this way I soon regained my normal, grave, attentive manner. When I entered the living-room, our 2 guests, whose names I could never remember, were seated on the sofa. My wife was mixing drinks. "Oh, there you are, Arthur," she said. "Where have you been?" I thought this was an unnecessary remark. "I'm so sorry," I said to the guests as we shook hands. I was busy and forgot the time." "We all know what you've been doing," the girl said, smiling wisely. "But we'll forgive him, won't we, dearest?" "I think we should," the husband answered. I had a frightful, fantastic vision of my wife telling them, amidst roars of laughter, precisely what I'd been doing upstairs. She couldn't have done that. I looked round at her, and she too was smiling as she measured out the gin. "I'm sorry we disturbed you," the girl said. I decided that if this was going to be a joke, then I'd better join in quickly, so I forced myself to smile with her. "You must let us see it," the girl continued. "See what?" "Your collection. Your wife says they're absolutely beautiful." I lowered myself slowly into a chair and relaxed. It was ridiculous to be so nervous and jumpy. "Are you interested in butterflies?" I asked her. "I'd love to see yours, Mr. Beecham." The martinis were distributed, and we settled down to a couple of hours of talk and drink before dinner. It was from then on that I began to form the impression that our guests were a charming couple. My wife, coming from a titled family, is apt to be conscious of her class and breeding, and is often hasty in her judgment of strangers who are friendly towards her, particularly tall men. She's frequently right, but in this case I felt she might be making a mistake. As a rule, I myself do not like tall men either. They are apt to be supercilious and omniscient. But Henry Snape, my wife had whispered his name, struck me as being an amiable, simple young man, with good manners, whose main preoccupation, very properly, was Mrs. Snape. He was handsome in a long-faced, horsey sort of way, with dark brown eyes that seemed to be gentle and sympathetic. I envied him his fine mop of black hair, and caught myself wondering what lotion he used to keep it looking so healthy. He did tell us one or two jokes, but they were on a high level, and no one could have objected. "At school," he said, "they used to call me Scurvix. Do you know why?" "I haven't the least idea," my wife answered. "Because cervix is Latin for nape." This was rather deep, and it took me a while to work out. "What school was that, Mr. Snape?" my wife asked. "Eton," he said, and my wife gave a quick little nod of approval. Now she'll talk to him, I thought. So I turned my attention to the other one, Sally Snape. She was an attractive girl with a bosom. Had I met her 15 years earlier, I might well have got myself into some sort of trouble. As it was, I had a pleasant enough time telling her all about my beautiful butterflies. I was observing her closely as I talked, and after a while I began to get the impression that she was not, in fact, quite so merry and smiling a girl as I had been led to believe at first. She seemed to be coiled in herself, as though with a secret she was jealously guarding. The deep blue eyes moved too quickly about the room, never settling or resting on one thing for more than a moment, and over all her face, though so faint that they might not even have been there, those small downward lines of sorrow. "I'm so looking forward to our game of bridge," I said, finally changing the subject. "Us too," she answered. "You know we play almost every night. We love it so." "You're extremely expert, both of you. How did you get to be so good?" "It's practice," she said. "That's all. Practice, practice, practice." "Have you played in any championships?" "Not yet, but Henry wants very much for us to do that. It's hard work, you know, to reach that standard. Terribly hard work." Was there not here, I wondered, a hint of resignation in her voice? Yes, that was probably it. He was pushing her too hard, making her take it too seriously, and the poor girl was tired of it all. At 8 o'clock, without changing, we moved into dinner. The meal went well, with Henry Snape telling us some very droll stories. He also praised my Richebourg 34 in a most knowledgeable fashion, which pleased me greatly. By the time coffee came, I realized that I'd grown to like these two youngsters immensely, and as a result I began to feel uncomfortable about this microphone business. It would have been all right if they'd been horrid people, but to play this trick on two such charming young persons as these filled me with a strong sense of guilt. Don't misunderstand me. I was not getting cold feet. It didn't seem necessary to stop the operation, but I refused to relish the prospect openly, as my wife seemed now to be doing, with covert smiles and winks and secret little noddings of the head. Around 9:30, feeling comfortable and well-fed, we returned to the large living room to start our bridge. We were playing for a fair stake, 10 shillings 100, so we decided not to split families, and I partnered my wife the whole time. We all four of us took the game seriously, which is the only way to take it, and we played silently, intently, hardly speaking at all, except to bid. It was not the money we played for, heaven knows my wife had enough of that, and so apparently did the Snapes, but among experts it's almost traditional that they play for a reasonable stake. That night the cards were evenly divided, but for once my wife played badly, so we got the worst of it. I could see that she wasn't concentrating fully, and as we came along towards midnight she began not even to care. She kept glancing up at me with those large grey eyes of hers, the eyebrows raised, the nostrils curiously open, a little gloating smile around the corner of her mouth. Our opponents played a fine game. Their bidding was masterly, and all through the evening they made only one mistake. That was when the girl badly overestimated her partner's hand and bid 6 spades. I doubled, and they went 3 down, vulnerable, which cost them 800 points. It was just a momentary lapse, but I remember that Sally Snape was very put out by it, even though her husband forgave her at once, kissing her hand across the table and telling her not to worry. Around 12:30, my wife announced that she wanted to go to bed. "Just one more rubber," Henry Snape said. "No, Mr. Snape, I'm tired tonight. Arthur's tired too, I can see it. Let's all go to bed." She herded us out of the room, and we went upstairs, the 4 of us together. On the way up there was the usual talk about breakfast and what they wanted and how they were to call the maid. "I think you'll like your room," my wife said. "It has a view right across the valley, and the sun comes to you in the morning around 10 o'clock. We were in the passage now, standing outside our own bedroom door, and I could see the wire I'd put down that afternoon and how it ran along the top of the skirting down to their room. Although it was nearly the same colour as the paint, it looked very conspicuous to me. "Sleep well," my wife said. "Sleep well, Mrs. Snape. Good night, Mr. Snape." I followed her into our room and shut the door. "Quick!" she cried. "Turn it on!" My wife was always like that, frightened that she was going to miss something. She had a reputation, when she went hunting, I never go myself, of always being right up with the hounds, whatever the cost to herself or her horse, for fear that she might miss a kill. I could see she had no intention of missing this one. The little radio warmed up just in time to catch the noise of their door opening and closing again. "There," my wife said, "they've gone in." She was standing in the centre of the room in her blue dress, her hands clasped before her, her head craned forward, intently listening, and the whole of the big white face seemed somehow to have gathered itself together, tight, like a wineskin. Almost at once the voice of Henry Snape came out of the radio, strong and clear. "You're just a goddamn little fool," he was saying, and this voice was so different from the one I remembered, so harsh and unpleasant it made me jump. "The whole bloody evening wasted. 800 points. That's £8 between us. I got mixed up, the girl answered. I won't do it again, I promise. What's this? My wife said. What's going on? Her mouth was wide open now, the eyebrows stretched up high, and she came quickly over to the radio and leaned forward, ear to the speaker. I must say I felt rather excited myself. I promise I won't do it again, the girl was saying. We're not taking any chances, the man answered grimly. We're going to have another practice right now. Oh, no, please, I couldn't stand it. Look, the man said. All the way out here to take money off this rich bitch, and you have to go and mess it up. My wife's turned to jump. The second time this week, he went on. I promise I won't do it again. Sit down. I'll sing them out, and you answer. No, Henry, please, not all 500 of them. It'll take 3 hours. All right, then. We'll leave out the finger positions. I think you're sure of those. We'll just do the basic bids showing honour tricks. Oh, Henry, must we? I'm so tired. It's absolutely essential you get them perfect, he said. We have a game every day next week, you know that, and we've got to eat. What is this? My wife whispered. What on earth is it? Shh, I said. Listen. All right, the man's voice was saying. Now, we'll start from the beginning. Ready? Oh, Henry, please. She sounded very near to tears. Come on, Sally. Pull yourself together. Then, in a quite different voice, the one we'd been used to hearing in the living room, Henry Snape said, 1 club. I noticed there was a curious lilting emphasis on the word 1, the first part of the word drawn out long. Ace, queen of clubs, the girl replied wearily. King, jack of spades, no hearts, and ace, jack of diamonds. And how many cards to each suit? Watch my finger positions carefully. You said we could miss those. Well, if you're quite sure you know them. Yes, I know them. A pause. Then, a club. King, jack of clubs, the girl recited. Ace of spades, queen, jack of hearts, and ace, queen of diamonds. Another pause. Then, I'll say 1 club. Ace, king of clubs. My heavens alive, I cried. It's a bidding code. They show every card in the hand. Arthur, it couldn't be. It's like those men who go into the audience and borrow something from you, and there's a girl blindfolded on the stage, and from the way he phrases the question, she can tell him exactly what it is, even a railway ticket, and what station it's from. It's impossible, not at all. But it's tremendous hard work to learn. Listen to them. I'll go 1 heart, the man's voice was saying. King, queen, 10 of hearts, ace, jack of spades, no diamonds, queen, jack of clubs. And you see, I said, he tells her the number of cards he has in each suit by the position of his fingers. How? I don't know. You heard him saying about it. My God, Arthur! Are you sure that's what they're doing? I'm afraid so. I watched her as she walked quickly over to the side of the bed to fetch a cigarette. She lit it with her back to me, and then swung around, blowing the smoke up at the ceiling in a thin stream. I knew we were going to have to do something about this, but I wasn't quite sure what, because we couldn't possibly accuse them without revealing the source of our information. I waited for my wife's decision. Why, Arthur, she said, slowly, blowing out clouds of smoke. Why, this is a marvellous idea. Do you think we could learn to do it?" "What?" "Of course. Why not?" "Sure. No. Wait a minute, Pamela." But she came swiftly across the room, right up close to me where I was standing, and she dropped her head and looked down at me. The old look of a smile that wasn't a smile, at the corners of the mouth and the curl of the nose, and the big, full grey eyes staring at me with their bright black centres. And then they were grey, and all the rest was white, flecked with hundreds of tiny red veins. And when she looked at me like this, hard and close, I swear to you, it made me feel as though I were drowning. "Yes," she said. "Why not?" "But, Pamela, good heavens, no. After all, Arthur, I do wish you wouldn't argue with me all the time." "That's exactly what we'll do. Now go fetch a deck of cards. We'll start right away."
Claude's dog, the Ratcatcher. In the afternoon, the Ratcatcher came to the filling station. He came sidling up the driveway with a stealthy, soft-treading gait, making no noise at all with his feet on the gravel. He had an army knapsack slung over one shoulder, and he was wearing an old-fashioned black jacket with large pockets. His brown corduroy trousers were tied around the knees with pieces of white string. "Yes?" Claude asked, knowing very well who he was. "Rodent operative." His small, dark eyes moved swiftly over the premises. "The Ratcatcher? That's me." The man was lean and brown, with a sharp face, and two long, sulphur-coloured teeth that protruded from the upper jaw, overlapping the lower lip, pressing it inward. The ears were thin and pointed, and set far back on the head, near the nape of the neck. The eyes were almost black, but when they looked at you, there was a flash of yellow somewhere inside them. "You come very quick." "Special orders from the elf officer." "And now you're going to catch all the rats?" "Yeah." The kind of dark, furtive eyes he had were those of an animal that lives its life peering out, cautiously, and forever from a hole in the ground. "How are you going to catch 'em?" "Oh," the rat man said darkly. "That's all according to where they is." "Trap 'em, I suppose." "Trap 'em?" he cried, disgusted. "You won't catch many rats that way. Rats isn't rabbits, you know." He held his face up high, sniffing the air with a nose that twitched perceptibly from side to side. "No," he said scornfully, "trapping's no way to catch a rat. Rats is clever. Let me tell you that, if you want to catch 'em, you gotta know 'em. You gotta know rats on this job." I could see Claude staring at him with a certain fascination. "They're more clever'n dogs, rats is." "Get away." "You know what they do? They watch you. All the time you're going round, preparing to catch 'em. They're sitting quietly in dark places watching you." The man crouched, stretching his stringy neck far forward. "So what you do?" Claude asked, fascinated. "Ah, that's it, you see. That's where you gotta know rats." "How'd you catch 'em?" "There's ways," the rat man said, leering. "There's various ways." He paused, nodding his repulsive head sagely up and down. "It's all depending," he said, "on where they is. This ain't a sewer job, is it?" "No, it's not a sewer job." "Oh, tricky things, sewer jobs." "Yes," he said, delicately sniffing the air to the left of him with his mobile nose end. Sewer jobs is very tricky things. Well, not especially, I shouldn't think. Oh, you shouldn't, should you? Well, I'd like to see you do a sewer job. Just exactly how would you set about it, I'd like to know. Nothing to it, I'd just poison them, that's all. And where exactly would you put the poison, might I ask? Down the sewer? Where the hell do you think I'd put it? There, the rat man cried, triumphant. I knew it. Down the sewer. And you know what happened then? Get washed away, that's all. Sewer's like a river, you know. Well, that's what you say, Claude answered. That's only what you say. It's facts. All right then, all right. So what would you do, Mr. Know-all? That's exactly where you gotta know rats on a sewer job. Well, come on then, let's have it. Now listen, I'll tell you. The rat man advanced a step closer. His voice became secretive and confidential, the voice of a man divulging fabulous professional secrets. You works on the understanding that a rat is a gnawing animal, see? Rats gnaws. Anything you give them, don't matter what it is, anything new they never seen before, and what do? They gnaws it. So now, there you are. You get a sewer job on your hands, and what do? His voice had the soft, throaty sound of a croaking frog, and he seemed to speak all his words with an immense, wet-lipped relish, as though they tasted good on the tongue. The accent was similar to Claude's, the broad, soft accent of the Buckinghamshire countryside, but his voice was more throaty, the words more fruity in his mouth. All you do is, you go down the sewer and you take along some ordinary paper bags. Just ordinary brown paper bags. And these bags is filled with plaster of Paris powder. Nothing else. Then you suspend the bags from the roof of the sewer, so they hang down, not quite touching the water. See? Not quite touching, and just high enough so a rat can reach 'em. Claude was listening, rapt. There you are, you see. Old rat comes swimming along the sewer and sees the bag. He stops. He takes a sniff at it, and it don't smell so bad anyway. So what's he do then? He gnaws it, Claude cried, delighted. There, that's it. That's exactly it. He starts gnawing away at the bag, and the bag breaks, and the old rat gets a mouthful of powder for his pains. Well, that does him. What? Kills him? Yep, kills him stony. Plaster of Paris ain't poisonous, you know. Ah, here you are. That's exactly where you're wrong, see. This powder swells. When you wet it, it swells. Gets into the rat's tubes and swells right up and kills him quicker than anything in the world. No. That's where you gotta know rats. The rat man's face glowed with a stealthy pride, and he rubbed his stringy fingers together, holding the hands up close to the face. Claude watched him, fascinated. Now, where's them rats? The word rats came out of his mouth, soft and throaty, with a rich, fruity relish, as though he were gargling with melted butter. Let's take a look at them rats. Over there in the hayrick, across the road. Not in the house? He asked, obviously disappointed. No, only round the hayrick, nowhere else. I'll wager they're in the house too. Like as not, getting in all your food in the night and spreading disease and sickness. Got any disease here? He asked, looking first at me, then at Claude. Everyone fine here? Quite sure? Oh, yes. You never know, you see. You could be sickening for weeks and weeks and not feel it, and all of a sudden, bang, and it's got you. That's why Dr. Arbuthnot's so particular. That's why he sent me out so quick, you see. Stop the spreading of disease. He had now taken upon himself the mantle of the health officer. A most important rat he was now, deeply disappointed that we were not suffering from bubonic plague. I feel fine, Claude said, nervously. The rat man searched his face again, but said nothing. And how are you going to catch him in the hayrick? The rat man grinned, a crafty, toothy grin. He reached down into his knapsack and withdrew a large tin, which he held up level with his face. He peered around one side of it at Claude. Poison, he whispered. But he pronounced it pison, making it into a soft, dark, dangerous word. Deadly poison. That's what this is. He was weighing the tin up and down in his hands as he spoke. Enough here to kill 1,000,000 men. Terrifying, Claude said. Exactly it. They put you inside for 6 months if they caught you with even a spoonful of this, he said, wetting his lips with his tongue. He had a habit of craning his head forward on his neck as he spoke. Want to see? He asked, taking a penny from his pocket, prizing open the lid. Here now, there it is. He spoke fondly, almost lovingly of the stuff, and he held it forward for Claude to look at. Corn or barley, is it? It's oats, soaked in deadly poison. You take just one of them grains in your mouth, and you'd be a goner in 5 minutes. Honest? Yeah. Never out of my sight, this tin. He caressed it with his hands and gave it a little shake so that the oat grains rustled softly inside. But not today. Your rats don't get this today. They wouldn't have it anyway, that they wouldn't. There's where you gotta know rats. Rats is suspicious. Terrible suspicious, rats is. So today they get some nice clean, tasty oats, as'll do 'em no harm in the world. Fatten 'em up, that's all it'll do. And tomorrow they get the same again, and it will taste so good there'll be all the rats in the district coming along after a couple of days. Rather clever. You gotta be clever on this job. You gotta be clever in a rat, and that's saying something. You almost got to be a rat yourself, I said. It slipped out in error, before I had time to stop myself, and I couldn't really help it because I was looking at the man at the time. But the effect upon him was surprising. There, he cried. Now you got it. Now you really said something. A good ratter has got to be more like a rat than anything else in the world. Clever even than a rat, and that's not an easy thing to be, let me tell you. Quite sure it's not. All right then, let's go. I haven't got all day, you know. There's Lady Leonora Banson asking for me urgent up there at the manor. She got rats too. Everybody's got rats, the rat man said, and he ambled off down the driveway, across the road to the hayrick, and we watched him go. The way he walked was so like a rat, it made you wonder. That slow, almost delicate, ambling walk, with a lot of give at the knees and no sound at all from the footsteps on the gravel. He hopped nimbly over the gate into the field, then walked quickly round the hayrick, scattering handfuls of oats onto the ground. The next day he returned and repeated the procedure. The day after that he came again, and this time he put down the poisoned oats. But he didn't scatter these. He placed them carefully in little piles at each corner of the rick. You got a dog? He asked, when he came back across the road on the third day after putting down the poison. Yes. Now, if you want to see your dog die an horrible, twisting death, all you got to do is let him in that gate sometime. We'll take care, Claude told him. Don't you worry about that. The next day he returned once more, this time to collect the dead. "You got an old sack?" he asked. "Most likely we're going to need a sack to put 'em in." He was puffed up and important now, the black eyes gleaming with pride. He was about to display the sensational results of his craft to the audience. Claude fetched a sack, and the three of us walked across the road, the rat man leading. Claude and I leaned over the gate, watching. The rat man prowled around the hayrick, bending over to inspect his little piles of poison. "Something wrong here," he muttered. His voice was soft and angry. He ambled over to another pile and got down on his knees to examine it closely. "Something's bloody wrong here." "What's the matter?" He didn't answer, but it was clear that the rats hadn't touched his bait. "These are very clever rats here," I said. "Exactly what I told him, Gordon. These aren't just no ordinary kind of rats you're dealing with here." The rat man walked over to the gate. He was very annoyed, and it showed on his face and around the nose and by the way the two yellow teeth were pressing down into the skin of his lower lip. "Don't give me that crap," he said, looking at me. "There's nothing wrong with these rats, except somebody's feeding 'em. They got something juicy to eat somewhere, and plenty of it. There's no rats in the world'll turn down oats unless their belly's full to bursting." "They're clever," Claude said. The man turned away, disgusted. He knelt down again and began to scoop up the poisoned oats with a small shovel, tipping them carefully back into the tin. When he had done, all three of us walked back across the road. The rat man stood near the petrol pumps. A rather sorry, humble rat man now, whose face was beginning to take on a brooding aspect. He had withdrawn into himself and was brooding in silence over his failure, the eyes veiled and wicked, the little tongue darting out to one side of the two yellow teeth, keeping the lips moist. It appeared to be essential that the lips should be kept moist. He looked up at me, a quick, surreptitious glance, then over at Claude. His nose end twitched, sniffing the air. He raised himself up and down a few times on his toes, swaying gently, and in a voice soft and secretive, he said, "Want to see something?" He was obviously trying to retrieve his reputation. "What?" "Want to see something amazing?" As he said this, he put his right hand into the deep poacher's pocket of his jacket and brought out a large, live rat clasped tight between his fingers. "Good God!" "Ha! That's it, you see." He was crouching slightly now, craning his neck forward and leering at us, and holding this enormous brown rat in his hands, one finger and thumb making a tight circle around the creature's neck, clamping its head rigid so it couldn't turn and bite. "Do you usually carry rats around in your pockets?" "Always got a rat or two about me somewhere." With that, he put his free hand into the other pocket and produced a small white ferret. "Ferret," he said, holding it up by the neck. The ferret seemed to know him and stayed still in his grasp. "There's nothing'll kill a rat quicker than a ferret, and there's nothing a rat's more frightened of either." He brought his hands close together in front of him, so that the ferret's nose was within 6 inches of the rat's face. The pink, beady eyes of the ferret stared at the rat. The rat struggled, trying to edge away from the killer. "Now," he said. "Watch." His khaki shirt was open at the neck, and he lifted the rat and slipped it down inside his shirt next to his skin. As soon as his hand was free, he unbuttoned his jacket at the front so that the audience could see the bulge the body of the rat made under his shirt. His belt prevented it from going down lower than his waist. Then he slipped the ferret in after the rat. Immediately there was a great commotion inside the shirt. It appeared that the rat was running around the man's body, being chased by the ferret. 6 or 7 times they went around, the small bulge chasing the larger one, gaining on it slightly each circuit and drawing closer and closer, until at last the two bulges seemed to come together, and there was a scuffle and a series of shrill shrieks. Throughout this performance, the rat man had stood absolutely still, with legs apart, arms hanging loosely, dark eyes resting on Claude's face. Now he reached one hand down into his shirt and pulled out the ferret. With the other, he took out the dead rat. There were traces of blood around the white muzzle of the ferret. Not sure I like that very much. You've never seen anything like it before, I'll bet you that. Can't really say I have. Like as not, you'll get yourself a nasty little nip in the guts one of these days, Claude told him. But he was clearly impressed, and the rat man was becoming cocky again. Want to see something far more amazing than that? He asked. You want to see something you never even believe unless you see it with your own eyes? Well? We were standing in the driveway out in front of the pumps, and it was one of those pleasant, warm November mornings. 2 cars pulled in for petrol, one right after the other, and Claude went over and gave them what they wanted. You want to see? The rat man asked. I glanced at Claude, slightly apprehensive. Yes, Claude said. Come on then. Let's see. The rat man slipped the dead rat back into one pocket, the ferret into the other. Then he reached down into his knapsack and produced, if you please, a second live rat. Good Christ, Claude said. Always got 1 or 2 rats about me somewhere, the man announced calmly. You gotta know rats on this job, and if you want to know 'em, you gotta have 'em around you. This is a sewer rat, this is, an old sewer rat, clever as buggery. See him watching me all the time, wondering what I'm gonna do. See him? Very unpleasant. What are you gonna do? I asked. I had a feeling I was going to like this one even less than the last. Fetch me a piece of string. Claude fetched him a piece of string. With his left hand, the man looped the string around one of the rat's hind legs. The rat struggled, trying to turn its head to see what was going on, but he held it tight around the neck with a finger and thumb. Now, he said, looking about him. You got a table inside? We don't want the rat inside the house, I said. Well, I need a table or something flat like a table. What about the bonnet of that car? Claude said. We walked over to the car and the man put the old sewer rat on the bonnet. He attached the string to the windshield wiper so that the rat was now tethered. At first it crouched, unmoving and suspicious. A big-bodied grey rat, bright black eyes, and a scaly tail that lay in a long curl upon the car's bonnet. It was looking away from the rat man, but watching him sideways to see what he was going to do. The man stepped back a few paces, and immediately the rat relaxed. It sat up on its haunches and began to lick the grey fur on its chest. Then it scratched its muzzle with both front paws. It seemed quite unconcerned about the 3 men standing nearby. Now, how about a little bet? The rat man asked. We don't bet, I said. Just for fun. It's more fun if you bet. What do you want to bet on? I'll bet you I can kill that rat without using my hands. I'll put my hands in my pockets and not use them. You'll kick it with your feet, Claude said. It was apparent that the rat man was about to earn some money. I looked at the rat that was going to be killed and began to feel slightly sick. Not so much because it was going to be killed, but because it was going to be killed in a special way, with a considerable degree of relish. No, the rat man said. No feet. Nor arms? Claude asked. Nor arms, nor legs, nor hands, neither. You'll sit on it? No squashing. Let's say you do it. Bet me first. Bet me a quid. Don't be so bloody daft, Claude said. Why should we give you a quid? What'll you bet? Nothing. All right, that's a no-go. He made as if to untie the string from the windshield wiper. I'll bet you a shilling, Claude told him. The sick, gastric sensation in my stomach was increasing. But there was an awful magnetism about this business, and I found myself quite unable to walk away, or even move. You too? No, I said. What's the matter with you? The rat man asked. I just don't want to bet you, that's all. Do you want me to do this for a lousy shilling? I don't want you to do it. Where's the money? He said to Claude. Claude put a shilling piece on the bonnet near the radiator. The rat man produced 2 sixpences and laid them beside Claude's money. As he stretched out his hand to do this, the rat cringed, drawing its head back and flattening itself against the bonnet. That's on, the rat man said. Claude and I stepped back a few paces. The rat man stepped forward. He put his hands in his pockets and inclined his body from the waist, so that his face was on a level with the rat, about 3 feet away. His eyes caught the eyes of the rat and held them. The rat was crouching, very tense, sensing extreme danger, but not yet frightened. The way it crouched, it seemed to me it was preparing to spring forward at the man's face. But there must have been some power in the rat man's eyes that prevented it from doing this, and subdued it, and then gradually frightened it, so that it began to back away, dragging its body backwards, with slow, crouching steps, until the string tautened on its hind leg. It tried to struggle back further against the string, jerking its leg to free it. The man leaned forward towards the rat, following it with his face, watching it all the time with his eyes. And suddenly, the rat panicked and leapt sideways in the air. The string pulled it up with a jerk that must almost have dislocated its leg. It crouched again, in the middle of the bonnet, as far away as the string would allow, and it was properly frightened now, whiskers quivering, the long grey body tense with fear. At this point, the rat man again began to move, his face closer. Very slowly he did it, so slowly that there wasn't really any movement to be seen at all, except that the face just happened to be a fraction closer each time you looked. He never took his eyes from the rat. The tension was considerable, and I wanted suddenly to cry out and tell him to stop. I wanted him to stop, because it was making me feel sick inside, but I couldn't bring myself to say the word. Something extremely unpleasant was about to happen. I was sure of that. Something sinister and cruel and rat-like, and perhaps it really would make me sick. But I had to see it now. The rat man's face was about 18 inches from the rat. 12 inches. Then 10. Or perhaps it was 8, and then there was not more than the length of a man's hand separating their faces. The rat was pressing its body flat against the car bonnet, tense and terrified. The rat man was also tense, but with a dangerous, active tensity that was like a tight-wound spring. The shadow of a smile flickered around the skin of his mouth. Then he suddenly struck. He struck. He struck as a snake strikes, darting his head forward with one swift, knife-like stroke that originated in the muscles of the lower body. And I had a momentary glimpse of his mouth opening very wide and 2 yellow teeth, and the whole face contorted by the effort of a mouth opening. More than that, I did not care to see. I closed my eyes, and when I opened them again, the rat was dead, and the rat man was slipping the money into his pocket and spitting to clear his mouth. That's what they makes licorice out of, he said. Rat's blood is what the big factories and the chocolate people use. to make licorice. Again, the relish, the wet-lipped, lip-smacking relish as he spoke the words, the throaty richness of his voice, and the thick, syrupy way he pronounced the word licorice. "No," he said. "There's nothing wrong with a bit of rat's blood." "Don't talk so absolutely disgusting," Claude told him. "Ah, but that's it, see? You've eaten it many a time. Penny sticks and licorice bootlaces is all made from rat's blood." "We don't want to hear about it, thank you." "Boiled up it is in great cauldrons, bubbling and steaming, and men stirring it with long poles. That's one of the big secrets of the chocolate-making factories, and no one knows about it. No one except the ratters, supplying the stuff." Suddenly he noticed that his audience was no longer with him, that our faces were hostile and sick-looking and crimson with anger and disgust. He stopped abruptly, and without another word he turned and sloped off down the driveway out onto the road, moving with a slow, that almost delicate ambling walk that was like a rat prowling, making no noise with his footsteps, even on the gravel of the driveway.
William and Mary.
William Pearl did not leave a great deal of money when he died, and his will was a simple one. With the exception of a few small bequests to relatives, he left all his property to his wife. The solicitor and Mrs. Pearl went over it together in the solicitor's office, and when the business was completed, the widow got up to leave. At that point, the solicitor took a sealed envelope from the folder on his desk and held it out to his client.
"I've been instructed to give you this," he said. "Your husband sent it to us shortly before he passed away."
The solicitor was pale and prim, and out of respect for a widow, he kept his head on one side as he spoke, looking downward.
"It appears that it might be something personal, Mrs. Pearl. No doubt you'd like to take it home with you and read it in privacy."
Mrs. Pearl accepted the envelope and went out into the street. She paused on the pavement, feeling the thing with her fingers. A letter of farewell from William? Probably, yes. A formal letter. It was bound to be formal. Stiff and formal. The man was incapable of acting otherwise. He'd never done anything informal in his life.
My dear Mary, I trust that you will not permit my departure from this world to upset you too much, but that you will continue to observe those precepts which have guided you so well during our partnership together. Be diligent and dignified in all things, be thrifty with your money, be very careful that you do not, etc., etc.
A typical William letter. Or was it possible that he might have broken down at the last moment and written her something beautiful? Maybe this was a beautiful, tender message, a sort of love letter, a lovely, warm note of thanks to her for giving him 30 years of her life, and for ironing 1,000,000 shirts and cooking 1,000,000 meals and making 1,000,000 beds, something that she could read over and over again, once a day at least, and she would keep it forever in the box on the dressing table, together with her brooches. There's no knowing what people will do when they're about to die, Mrs. Pearl told herself, and she tucked the envelope under her arm and hurried home. She let herself in the front door and went straight to the living room and sat down on the sofa without removing her hat or coat. Then she opened the envelope and drew out the contents. These consisted, she saw, of some 15 or 20 sheets of lined white paper, folded over once and held together at the top left-hand corner by a clip. Each sheet was covered with the small, neat, forward-sloping writing that she knew so well. But when she noticed how much of it there was, and in what a neat, business-like manner it was written, and how the first page didn't even begin in the nice way a letter should, she began to get suspicious. She looked away. She lit herself a cigarette. She took one puff and laid the cigarette in the ashtray. If this is about what I'm beginning to suspect it is about, she told herself, then I don't want to read it. Can one refuse to read a letter from the dead? Yes. Well... She glanced over at William's empty chair on the other side of the fireplace. It was a big, brown leather armchair, and there was a depression on the seat of it, made by his buttocks over the years. Higher up, on the backrest, there was a dark oval stain on the leather where his head had rested. He used to sit reading in that chair, and she would be opposite him on the sofa, sewing on buttons or mending socks or putting a patch on the elbow of one of his jackets, and every now and then a pair of eyes would glance up from the book and settle on her, watchful, but strangely impersonal, as if calculating something. She'd never liked those eyes. They were ice blue, cold, small, and rather close together, with two deep vertical lines of disapproval dividing them. All her life they had been watching her. And even now, after a week alone in the house, she sometimes had an uneasy feeling that they were still there, following her around, staring at her from doorways, from empty chairs, through a window at night. Slowly she reached into her handbag and took out her spectacles and put them on. Then, holding the pages up high in front of her so that they caught the late afternoon light from the window behind, she started to read.
This note, my dear Mary, is entirely for you, and will be given you shortly after I am gone. Do not be alarmed by the sight of all this writing. It is nothing but an attempt on my part to explain to you precisely what Landy is going to do to me, and why I have agreed that he should do it, and what are his theories and his hopes. You are my wife, and you have a right to know these things. In fact, you must know them. During the past few days, I've tried very hard to speak with you about Landy, but you have steadfastly refused to give me a hearing. This, as I have already told you, is a very foolish attitude to take, and I find it not entirely an unselfish one either. It stems mostly from ignorance, and I am absolutely convinced that if only you were made aware of all the facts, you would immediately change your view. That is why I am hoping that when I am no longer with you and your mind is less distracted, you will consent to listen to me more carefully through these pages. I swear to you that when you have read my story, your sense of antipathy will vanish, and enthusiasm will take its place. I even dare to hope that you will become a little proud of what I've done. As you read on, you must forgive me, if you will, for the coolness of my style. But this is the only way I know of getting my message over to you clearly. You see, as my time draws near, it is natural that I begin to brim with every kind of sentimentality under the sun. Each day I grow more extravagantly wistful, especially in the evenings, and unless I watch myself closely, my emotions will be overflowing onto these pages. I have a wish, for example, to write something about you, and what a satisfactory wife you have been to me through the years, and I'm promising myself that if there's time, and I still have the strength, I shall do that next. I have a yearning also to speak about this Oxford of mine, where I've been living and teaching for the past 17 years, to tell something about the glory of the place, and to explain, if I can, a little of what it has meant to have been allowed to work in its midst. All the things and places that I loved so well keep crowding in on me now in this gloomy bedroom. They are bright and beautiful as they always were, and today, for some reason, I can see them more clearly than ever. The path around the lake in the gardens of Worcester College, where Lovelace used to walk. The gateway at Pembroke, the view westward over the town from Magdalen Tower, the great hall at Christchurch, the little rockery at St. John's, where I have counted more than a dozen varieties of campanula, including the rare and dainty C. waldsteiniana. But there you see, I haven't even begun, and already I'm falling into the trap. So let me get started now, and let you read it slowly, my dear, without any of that sense of sorrow or disapproval that might otherwise embarrass your understanding. Promise me now that you will read it slowly, and that you will put yourself in a cool and patient frame of mind before you begin. The details of the illness that struck me down so suddenly in my middle life are known to you. I need not waste time upon them, except to admit at once how foolish I was not to have gone earlier to my doctor. Cancer is one of the few remaining diseases that these modern drugs cannot cure. A surgeon can operate, if it has not spread too far, but with me, not only did I leave it too late, but the thing had the effrontery to attack me in the pancreas, making both surgery and survival equally impossible. So here I was, with somewhere between 1 and 6 months left to live, growing more melancholy every hour, and then, all of a sudden, in comes Landy. That was 6 weeks ago, on a Tuesday morning, very early, long before your visiting time, and the moment he entered I knew there was some sort of madness in the wind. He didn't creep in on his toes, sheepish and embarrassed, not knowing what to say, like all my other visitors. He came in strong and smiling, and he strode up to the bed and stood there looking down at me with a wild, bright glimmer in his eyes, and he said, "William, my boy, this is perfect. You're just the one I want." Perhaps I should explain to you here that although John Landy has never been to our house, and you have seldom if ever met him, I myself have been friendly with him for at least 9 years. I am, of course, primarily a teacher of philosophy, but as you know, I've lately been dabbling a good deal in psychology as well. Landy's interests and mine have therefore slightly overlapped. He is a magnificent neurosurgeon, one of the finest, and recently he has been kind enough to let me study the results of some of his work, especially the varying effects of prefrontal lobotomies upon different types of psychopath. So you can see that when he suddenly burst in on me on that Tuesday morning, we were by no means strangers to one another. "Look," he said, pulling up a chair beside the bed, "in a few weeks you're going to be dead, correct?" Coming from Landy, the question didn't seem especially unkind. In a way, it was refreshing to have a visitor brave enough to touch upon the forbidden subject. "You're going to expire right here in this room, and then they'll take you out and cremate you." "Bury me," I said. "That's even worse. And then what? Do you believe you'll go to heaven?" "I doubt it," I said, "though it would be comforting to think so." "Or hell, perhaps?" "I don't really see why they should send me there." "You never know, my dear William." "What's all this about?" I asked. "Well," he said, and I could see him watching me carefully. "Personally, I don't believe that after you're dead you'll ever hear of yourself again. Unless—" and here he paused and smiled and leaned closer. "Unless, of course, you have the sense to put yourself into my hands. Would you care to consider a proposition?" The way he was staring at me and studying me and appraising me with a queer kind of hungriness, I might have been a piece of prime beef on the counter, and he had bought it and was waiting for them to wrap it up. "I'm really serious about it, William. Would you care to consider a proposition?" "I don't know what you're talking about." "Then listen, and I'll tell you. Will you listen to me?" "Go on, then, if you like. I doubt I've got very much to lose by hearing it." "On the contrary, you have a great deal to gain, especially after you're dead." I'm sure he was expecting me to jump when he said this, but for some reason I was ready for it. I lay quite still, watching his face and that slow white smile of his that always revealed the gold clasp of an upper denture curled around the canine on the left side of his mouth. "This is a thing, William, that I've been working on quietly for some years. 1 or 2 others here at the hospital have been helping me, especially Morrison. and we've completed a number of fairly successful trials with laboratory animals. I'm at the stage now where I'm ready to have a go with a man. It's a big idea, and it may sound a bit far-fetched at first, but from a surgical point of view there doesn't seem to be any reason why it shouldn't be more or less practicable. Landy leaned forward and placed both hands on the edge of my bed. He has a good face, handsome in a bony sort of way, with none of the usual doctor's look about it. You know that look, most of them have it. It glimmers at you, out of their eyeballs, like a dull electric sign, and it reads, "Only I can save you." But John Landy's eyes were wide and bright, and little sparks of excitement were dancing in the centres of them. "Quite a long time ago," he said, "I saw a short medical film that had been brought over from Russia. It was a rather gruesome thing, but interesting. It showed a dog's head completely severed from the body, but with the normal blood supply being maintained through the arteries and veins by means of an artificial heart. Now the thing is this. That dog's head, sitting there all alone on a sort of tray, was alive. The brain was functioning. They proved it by several tests. For example, when food was smeared on the dog's lips, the tongue would come out and lick it away, and the eyes would follow a person moving across the room. It seemed reasonable to conclude from this that the head and the brain did not need to be attached to the rest of the body in order to remain alive, provided, of course, that a supply of properly oxygenated blood could be maintained. Now then, my own thought, which grew out of seeing this film, was to remove the brain from the skull of a human and keep it alive and functioning as an independent unit for an unlimited period after he is dead. Your brain, for example, after you are dead. It manufactures its own cerebrospinal fluid. The magic processes of thought and memory which go on inside it are manifestly not impaired by the absence of limbs or trunk or even of skull, provided, as I say, that you keep pumping in the right kind of oxygenated blood under the proper conditions. My dear William, just think for a moment of your own brain. It's in perfect shape. It's crammed full of a lifetime of learning. It has taken you years of work to make it what it is. It is just beginning to give out some first-rate original ideas. Yet soon it's going to have to die along with the rest of your body simply because your silly little pancreas is riddled with cancer. "No, thank you," I said to him. "You can stop there. It's a repulsive idea, and even if you could do it, which I doubt, it would be quite pointless. What possible use is there in keeping my brain alive if I couldn't talk or see or hear or feel? Personally, I can think of nothing more unpleasant." "I believe that you would be able to communicate with us," Landy said, "and we might even succeed in giving you a certain amount of vision. But let's take this slowly. I'll come to all that later on. The fact remains that you're going to die fairly soon, whatever happens, and my plans would not involve touching you at all until after you are dead. Come now, William. No true philosopher could object to lending his dead body to the cause of science." "Well, that's not putting it quite straight," I answered. "It seems to me there'd be some doubts as to whether I were dead or alive by the time you'd finished with me." "Well," he said, smiling a little, "I suppose you're right about that, but I don't think you ought to turn me down quite so quickly before you know a bit more about it." I said I don't want to hear it. "Have a cigarette," he said, holding out his case. "I don't smoke, you know that." He took one himself and lit it with a tiny silver lighter that was no bigger than a shilling piece. "A present from the people who make my instruments," he said. "Ingenious, isn't it?" I examined the lighter, then handed it back. "May I go on?" he asked. "I'd rather you didn't. Just lie still and listen. I think you'll find it quite interesting." There were some blue grapes on a plate beside my bed. I put the plate on my chest and began eating the grapes. "At the very moment of death," Landy said, "I should have to be standing by so that I could step in immediately and try to keep your brain alive." "You mean leaving it in the head?" "To start with, yes, I'd have to." "And where would you put it after that?" "If you want to know, in a sort of basin." Are you really serious about this? Certainly I'm serious. All right, go on. I suppose you know that when the heart stops and the brain is deprived of fresh blood and oxygen, its tissues die very rapidly. Anything from 4 to 6 minutes and the whole thing's dead. Even after 3 minutes you may get a certain amount of damage, so I should have to work rapidly to prevent this from happening. But with the help of the machine, it should all be quite simple. What machine? The artificial heart. We've got a nice adaptation here of the one originally devised by Alexis Carrel and Lindbergh. It oxygenates the blood, keeps it at the right temperature, pumps it in at the right pressure, and does a number of other little necessary things. It's really not at all complicated. Tell me what you would do at the moment of death, I said. What is the first thing you would do? Do you know anything about the vascular and venous arrangement of the brain? No. Then listen, it's not difficult. The blood supply to the brain is derived from 2 main sources, the internal carotid arteries and the vertebral arteries. There are 2 of each, making 4 arteries in all. Got that? Yes. And the return system is even simpler. The blood is drained away by only 2 large veins, the internal jugulars. So you have 4 arteries going up, they go up the neck, of course, and 2 veins coming down. Around the brain itself they naturally branch out into other channels, but those don't concern us. We never touch them. All right, I said. Imagine that I've just died. Now what would you do? I should immediately open your neck and locate the 4 arteries, the carotids and the vertebrals. I should then perfuse them, which means that I'd stick a large hollow needle into each. These 4 needles would be connected by tubes to the artificial heart. Then, working quickly, I would dissect out both the left and right jugular veins and hitch these also to the heart machine to complete the circuit. Now switch on the machine, which is already primed with the right type of blood, and there you are. The circulation through your brain would be restored. I'd be like that Russian dog. I don't think you would. For one thing, you'd certainly lose consciousness when you died, and I very much doubt whether you would come to again for quite a long time, if indeed you came to at all. But, conscious or not, you'd be in a rather interesting position, wouldn't you? You'd have a cold, dead body and a living brain. Landy paused to savour this delightful prospect. The man was so entranced and bemused by the whole idea that he evidently found it impossible to believe I might not be feeling the same way. We could now afford to take our time, he said, and believe me, we'd need it. The first thing we'd do would be to wheel you to the operating room, accompanied, of course, by the machine, which must never stop pumping. The next problem— All right, I said, that's enough. I don't have to hear the details. No, but you must, he said. It's important that you should know precisely what is going to happen to you all the way through. You see, afterwards, when you regain consciousness, it will be much more satisfactory from your point of view if you're able to remember exactly where you are and how you came to be there. If only for your own peace of mind you should know that. You agree? I lay still on the bed, watching him. So the next problem would be to remove your brain, intact and undamaged, from your dead body. The body is useless. In fact, it has already started to decay. The skull and the face are also useless. They're both encumbrances, and I don't want them around. All I want is the brain. The clean, beautiful brain, alive and perfect. So when I get you on the table, I will take a saw, a small oscillating saw, and with this I shall proceed to remove the whole vault of your skull. You'd still be unconscious at that point, so I wouldn't have to bother with anaesthetic. Like hell you wouldn't, I said. You'd be out cold, I promise you that, William. Don't forget you died just a few minutes before. Nobody's sawing off the top of my skull without an anaesthetic, I said. Landy shrugged his shoulders. It makes no difference to me, he said. I'll be glad to give you a little procaine if you want it. If it'll make you any happier, I'll infiltrate the whole scalp with procaine, the whole head from the neck up. Thanks very much, I said. You know, he went on, It's extraordinary what sometimes happens. Only last week a man was brought in unconscious, and I opened his head without any anaesthetic at all and removed a small blood clot. I was still working inside the skull when he woke up and began talking. "Where am I?" he asked. "You're in hospital." "Well," he said, "fancy that." "Tell me," I asked him, "is this bothering you, what I'm doing?" "No," he answered, "not at all. What are you doing?" "I'm just removing a blood clot from your brain." "You are? Just lie still, don't move, I'm nearly finished." "So that's the bastard who's been giving me all those headaches," the man said. Landy paused and smiled, remembering the occasion. "That's word for word what the man said," he went on, although the next day he couldn't even recollect the incident. It's a funny thing, the brain. "I'll have the procaine," I said. "As you wish, William. And now, as I say, I'd take a small oscillating saw and carefully remove your complete calvarium, the whole vault of the skull. This would expose the top half of the brain, or rather the outer covering in which it is wrapped. You may or may not know that there are 3 separate coverings around the brain itself. The outer one, called the dura mater, or dura, the middle one, called the arachnoid, and the inner one, called the pia mater, or pia. Most laymen seem to have the idea that the brain is a naked thing floating around in fluid in your head, but it isn't. It's wrapped up neatly in these 3 strong coverings, and the cerebrospinal fluid actually flows within the little gap between the coverings, known as the subarachnoid space. As I told you before, this fluid is manufactured by the brain, and it drains off into the venous system by osmosis. I myself would leave all 3 coverings. Don't they have lovely names? The dura, the arachnoid, and the pia. I'd leave them all intact. There are many reasons for this, not least among them being the fact that within the dura run the venous channels that drain the blood from the brain into the jugular. "Now," he went on, "we've got the upper half of your skull off, so that the top of the brain, wrapped in its outer covering, is exposed. The next step is the really tricky one, to release the whole package so that it can be lifted cleanly away, leaving the stubs of the 4 supply arteries and the 2 veins hanging underneath, ready to be reconnected to the machine. This is an immensely lengthy and complicated business, involving the delicate chipping away of much bone, the severing of many nerves, and the cutting and tying of numerous blood vessels. The only way I could do it, with any hope of success, would be by taking a rongeur and slowly biting off the rest of your skull, peeling it off downward like an orange until the sides and underneath of the brain covering are fully exposed. The problems involved are highly technical, and I won't go into them, but I feel fairly sure that the work can be done. It's simply a question of surgical skill and patience. And don't forget that I'd have plenty of time, as much as I wanted, because the artificial heart would be continually pumping away alongside the operating table, keeping the brain alive. Now, let's assume that I've succeeded in peeling off your skull and removing everything else that surrounds the sides of the brain. That leaves it connected to the body only at the base, mainly by the spinal column and by the 2 large veins and the 4 arteries that are supplying it with blood. So, what next? I would sever the spinal column just above the first cervical vertebra, taking great care not to harm the 2 vertebral arteries which are in that area. But you must remember that the dura, or outer covering, is open at this place to receive the spinal column, so I'd have to close this opening by sewing the edges of the dura together. There'd be no problem there. At this point, I would be ready for the final move. To one side on a table, I'd have a basin of a special shape, and this would be filled with what we call Ringer's solution. That is a special kind of fluid we use for irrigation in neurosurgery. I would now cut the brain completely loose by severing the supply arteries and the veins. Then I would simply pick it up in my hands and transfer it to the basin. This would be the only other time during the whole proceeding when the blood flow would be cut off, but once it was in the basin, it wouldn't take a moment to reconnect the stubs of the arteries and veins to the artificial heart. "So there you are," Landy said. "Your brain is now in the basin and still alive, and there isn't any reason why it shouldn't stay alive for a very long time. Years and years, perhaps, provided we looked after the blood and the machine." But would it function? My dear William, how should I know? I can't even tell you whether it would regain consciousness. And if it did? There now. That would be fascinating. Would it? I said, and I must admit I had my doubts. Of course it would, lying there with all your thinking processes working beautifully, and your memory as well. And not being able to see, or feel, or smell, or hear, or talk, I said. Ah, he cried, I knew I'd forgotten something. I never told you about the eye. Listen, I'm going to try to leave one of your optic nerves intact, as well as the eye itself. The optic nerve is a little thing about the thickness of a clinical thermometer, and about 2 inches in length as it stretches between the brain and the eye. The beauty of it is that it's not really a nerve at all. It's an outpouching of the brain itself, and the dura or brain covering extends along it and is attached to the eyeball. The back of the eye is therefore in very close contact with the brain, and cerebrospinal fluid flows right up to it. All this suits my purpose very well, and makes it reasonable to suppose that I could succeed in preserving one of your eyes. I've already constructed a small plastic case to contain the eyeball instead of your own socket, and when the brain is in the basin, submerged in Ringer's solution, the eyeball in its case will float on the surface of the liquid. Staring at the ceiling, I said. I suppose so, yes. I'm afraid there wouldn't be any muscles there to move it around, but it might be sort of fun to lie there so quietly and comfortably, peering out at the world from your basin. Hilarious, I said. How about leaving me an ear as well? I'd rather not try an ear this time. I want an ear, I said. I insist upon an ear. No, I want to listen to Bach. You don't understand how difficult it would be, Landy said gently. The hearing apparatus, the cochlea as it's called, is a far more delicate mechanism than the eye. What's more, it is encased in bone. So is a part of the auditory nerve that connects it with the brain. I couldn't possibly chisel the whole thing out intact. Couldn't you leave it encased in the bone and bring the bone to the basin? No, he said firmly. This thing is complicated enough already, and anyway, if the eye works, it doesn't matter all that much about your hearing. We can always hold up messages for you to read. You really must leave me to decide what is possible and what isn't. I haven't yet said that I'm going to do it. I know, William, I know. I'm not sure I fancy the idea very much. Would you rather be dead altogether? Perhaps I would. I don't know yet. I wouldn't be able to talk, would I? Of course not. Then how would I communicate with you? How would you know that I'm conscious? It would be easy for us to know whether or not you regain consciousness, Landy said. The ordinary electroencephalograph could tell us that. We'd attach the electrodes directly to the frontal lobes of your brain there in the basin. And you could actually tell? Oh, definitely. Any hospital could do that part of it. But I couldn't communicate with you. As a matter of fact, Landy said, I believe you could. There's a man up in London called Wertheimer who's doing some interesting work on the subject of thought communication, and I've been in touch with him. You know, don't you, that the thinking brain throws off electrical and chemical discharges, and that these discharges go out in the form of waves, rather like radio waves? I know a bit about it, I said. Well, Wertheimer has constructed an apparatus somewhat similar to the encephalograph, though far more sensitive, and he maintains that within certain narrow limits it can help him to interpret the actual things that a brain is thinking. It produces a kind of graph, which is apparently decipherable into words or thoughts. Would you like me to ask Wertheimer to come and see you? No, I said. Landy was already taking it for granted that I was going to go through with this business, and I resented his attitude. Go away now and leave me alone, I told him. You won't get anywhere by trying to rush me. He stood up at once and crossed to the door. One question, I said. He paused with a hand on the doorknob. Yes, William? Simply this. Do you yourself honestly believe that when my brain is in that basin, my mind will be able to function exactly as it is doing at present? Do you believe that I will be able to think and reason as I can now? And will the power of memory remain?" "I don't see why not," he answered. "It's the same brain. It's alive. It's undamaged. In fact, it's completely untouched. We haven't even opened the dura. The big difference, of course, would be that we've severed every single nerve that leads into it, except for the one optic nerve, and this means that your thinking would no longer be influenced by your senses. You'd be living in an extraordinarily pure and detached world. Nothing to bother you at all, not even pain. You couldn't possibly feel pain, because there wouldn't be any nerves to feel it with. In a way, it would be an almost perfect situation. No worries or fears or pains or hunger or thirst. Not even any desires. Just your memories and your thoughts. And if the remaining eye happened to function, then you could read books as well. It all sounds rather pleasant to me." "It does it?" "Yes, William, it does. And particularly for a doctor of philosophy. It would be a tremendous experience. You'd be able to reflect upon the ways of the world with a detachment and a serenity that no man had ever attained before. And who knows what might not happen then? Great thoughts and solutions might come to you, great ideas that could revolutionize our way of life. Try to imagine, if you can, the degree of concentration that you'd be able to achieve." "And the frustration," I said. "Nonsense. There couldn't be any frustration. You can't have frustration without desire, and you couldn't possibly have any desire. Not physical desire, anyway. I should certainly be capable of remembering my previous life in the world, and I might desire to return to it." "What? To this mess? Out of your comfortable basin, and back into this madhouse?" "Answer one more question," I said. "How long do you believe you could keep it alive?" "The brain? Who knows? Possibly for years and years. The conditions would be ideal. Most of the factors that cause deterioration would be absent thanks to the artificial heart. The blood pressure would remain constant at all times, an impossible condition in real life. The temperature would also be constant. The chemical composition of the blood would be near perfect. There would be no impurities in it, no virus, no bacteria, nothing. Of course, it's foolish to guess, but I believe that a brain might live for 200 or 300 years in circumstances like these. Goodbye for now," he said. "I'll drop in and see you tomorrow." He went out quickly, leaving me, as you might guess, in a fairly disturbed state of mind. My immediate reaction after he had gone was one of revulsion towards the whole business. Somehow it wasn't at all nice. There was something basically repulsive about the idea that I myself, with all my mental faculties intact, should be reduced to a small slimy blob lying in a pool of water. It was monstrous, obscene, unholy. Another thing that bothered me was the feeling of helplessness that I was bound to experience once Landy had got me into the basin. There could be no going back after that, no way of protesting or explaining. I would be committed for as long as they could keep me alive. And what, for example, if I could not stand it? What if it turned out to be terribly painful? What if I became hysterical? No legs to run away on, no voice to scream with, nothing. I'd just have to grin and bear it for the next 2 centuries. No mouth to grin with, either. At this point, a curious thought struck me, and it was this. Does not a man who has had a leg amputated often suffer from the delusion that the leg is still there? Does he not tell the nurse that the toes he doesn't have any more are itching like mad, and so on and so forth? I seem to have heard something to that effect quite recently. Very well. On the same premise, was it not possible that my brain, lying there alone in that basin, might not suffer from a similar delusion in regard to my body? In which case, all my usual aches and pains could come flooding over me, and I wouldn't even be able to take an aspirin to relieve them. One moment I might be imagining that I had the most excruciating cramp in my leg, or a violent indigestion, and a few minutes later I might easily get the feeling that my poor bladder, you know me, was so full that if I didn't get to emptying it soon it would burst. Heaven forbid! I lay there for a long time thinking these horrid thoughts. Then quite suddenly, round about midday, my mood began to change. I became less concerned with the unpleasant aspect of the affair, and found myself able to examine Landy's proposals in a more reasonable light. Was there not, after all, I asked myself, something a bit comforting in the thought that my brain might not necessarily have to die and disappear in a few weeks' time? There was indeed. I'm rather proud of my brain. It is a sensitive, lucid and uberous organ. It contains a prodigious store of information, and it is still capable of producing imaginative and original theories. As brains go, it's a damn good one, though I say it myself. Whereas my body, my poor old body, the thing that Landy wants to throw away, well, even you, my dear Mary, will have to agree with me that there is really nothing about that which is worth preserving any more. I was lying on my back, eating a grape. Delicious it was. And there were 3 little seeds in it, which I took out of my mouth and placed on the edge of the plate. "I'm going to do it," I said quietly. "Yes, by God, I'm going to do it. When Landy comes back to see me tomorrow, I shall tell him straight out that I'm going to do it." It was as quick as that, and from then on I began to feel very much better. I surprised everyone by gobbling an enormous lunch, and shortly after that you came in to visit me as usual. But how well I looked, you told me, how bright and well and chirpy. Had anything happened? Was there some good news? Yes, I said there was. And then, if you remember, I bade you sit down and make yourself comfortable, and I began immediately to explain to you as gently as I could what was in the wind. Alas, you would have none of it. I had hardly begun telling you the barest details when you flew into a fury and said that the thing was revolting, disgusting, horrible, unthinkable, and when I tried to go on, you marched out of the room. Well, Mary, as you know, I have tried to discuss this subject with you many times since then, but you have consistently refused to give me a hearing. Hence this note, and I can only hope that you will have the good sense to permit yourself to read it. It has taken me a long time to write. 2 weeks have gone since I started to scribble the first sentence, and I'm now a good deal weaker than I was then. I doubt whether I have the strength to say much more. Certainly I won't say good-bye, because there's a chance, just a tiny chance, that if Landy succeeds in his work, I may actually see you again later. That is, if you can bring yourself to come and visit me. I am giving orders that these pages shall not be delivered to you until a week after I am gone. By now, therefore, as you sit reading them, 7 days have already elapsed since Landy did the deed. You yourself may even know what the outcome has been. If you don't, if you have purposely kept yourself apart and have refused to have anything to do with it, which I suspect may be the case, please change your mind now and give Landy a call to see how things went with me. That is the least you can do. I have told him that he may expect to hear from you on the 7th day. Your faithful husband, William. P.S. Be good when I am gone, and always remember that it is harder to be a widow than a wife. Do not drink cocktails. Do not waste money. Do not smoke cigarettes. Do not eat pastry. Do not use lipstick. Do not buy a television apparatus. Keep my rosebeds and my rockery well weeded in the summers. And, incidentally, I suggest that you have the telephone disconnected, now that I shall have no further use for it. W.
Mrs. Pearl laid the last page of the manuscript slowly down on the sofa beside her. Her little mouth was pursed up tight, and there was a whiteness around her nostrils. But really, you would think a widow was entitled to a bit of peace after all these years. The whole thing was just too awful to think about. Beastly and awful. It gave her the shudders. She reached for her bag and found herself another cigarette. She lit it, inhaling the smoke deeply and blowing it out in clouds all over the room. Through the smoke she could see her lovely television set, brand new, lustrous, huge, crouching defiantly but also a little self-consciously on top of what used to be William's work table. What would he say, she wondered, if he could see that now? She paused to remember the last time he had caught her smoking a cigarette. That was about a year ago, and she was sitting in the kitchen by the open window, having a quick one before he came home from work. She'd had the radio on loud, playing dance music, and she had turned round to pour herself another cup of coffee, and there he was, standing in the doorway, huge and grim, staring down at her with those awful eyes, a little black dot of fury blazing in the centre of each. For 4 weeks after that, he'd paid the housekeeping bills himself and given her no money at all. But of course he wasn't to know that she had over £6 salted away in a soap flake carton in the cupboard under the sink. "What is it?" she had said to him once during supper. "Are you worried about me getting lung cancer?" "I am not," he'd answered. "Then why can't I smoke?" "Because I disapprove. That's why." He had also disapproved of children, and as a result, they had never had any of them either. Where was he now, this William of hers, the great disapprover? Landy would be expecting her to call up. Did she have to call Landy? Well, not really. No. She finished her cigarette, then lit another one immediately from the old stub. She looked at the telephone that was sitting on the work table beside the television set. William had asked her to call. He had specifically requested that she telephone Landy as soon as she had read the letter. She hesitated, fighting hard now against that old ingrained sense of duty that she didn't quite yet dare to shake off. Then, slowly, she got to her feet and crossed over to the phone on the work table. She found a number in the book, dialed it, and waited. "I want to speak to Mr. Landy, please." "Who's calling?" "Mrs. Pearl. Mrs. William Pearl." "One moment, please." Almost at once, Landy was on the other end of the wire. "Mrs. Pearl?" "This is Mrs. Pearl." There was a slight pause. "I'm so glad you've called at last, Mrs. Pearl. You're quite well, I hope?" The voice was quiet, unemotional, courteous. "I wonder if you would care to come over here to the hospital. Then we can have a little chat. I expect you're very eager to know how it all came out." She didn't answer. "I can tell you now that everything went pretty smoothly, one way and another. Far better, in fact, than I was entitled to hope. It is not only alive, Mrs. Pearl, it is conscious. It recovered consciousness on the 2nd day. Isn't that interesting?" She waited for him to go on. "And the eye is seeing. We're sure of that because we get an immediate change in the deflections on the encephalograph when we hold something up in front of it. And now we're giving it the newspaper to read every day." "Which newspaper?" Mrs. Pearl asked sharply. "The Daily Mirror. The headlines are larger." "He hates the Mirror. Give him the Times." There was a pause, then the doctor said, "Very well, Mrs. Pearl, we'll give it the Times. We naturally want to do all we can to keep it happy." "Him," she said. "Not it. Him." "Him," the doctor said. "Yes, I beg your pardon. To keep him happy. That's one reason why I suggested you should come along here as soon as possible. I think it would be good for him to see you. You could indicate how delighted you were to be with him again, smile at him and blow him a kiss and all that sort of thing. It's bound to be a comfort to him to know that you're standing by." There was a long pause. "Well," Mrs. Pearl said at last, her voice suddenly very meek and tired, "I suppose I had better come on over and see how he is." "Good. I knew you would. I'll wait here for you. Come straight up to my office on the second floor. Goodbye. Half an hour later, Mrs. Pearl was at the hospital. You mustn't be surprised by what he looks like, Landy said as he walked beside her down a corridor. No, I won't. It's bound to be a bit of a shock to you at first. He's not very prepossessing in his present state, I'm afraid. I didn't marry him for his looks, Doctor. Landy turned and stared at her. What a queer little woman this was, he thought, with her large eyes and her sullen, resentful air. Her features, which must have been quite pleasant ones, had now gone completely. The mouth was slack, the cheeks loose and flabby, and the whole face gave the impression of having slowly but surely sagged to pieces through years and years of joyless married life. They walked on for a while in silence. Take your time when you get inside, Landy said. He won't know you're in there until you place your face directly above his eye. The eye is always open, but he can't move it at all, so the field of vision is very narrow. At present we have it looking up at the ceiling, and of course he can't hear anything. We can talk together as much as we like. It's in here. Landy opened a door and ushered her into a small, square room. I wouldn't go too close yet, he said, putting a hand on her arm. Stay back here a moment with me, until you get used to it all. There was a biggish white enamel bowl, about the size of a wash-basin, standing on a high white table in the centre of the room, and there were 6 thin plastic tubes coming out of it. These tubes were connected with a whole lot of glass piping, in which you could see the blood flowing to and from the heart machine. The machine itself made a soft, rhythmic, pulsing sound. He's in there, Landy said, pointing to the basin, which was too high for her to see into. Come just a little closer, not too near. He led her 2 paces forward. By stretching her neck, Mrs. Pearl could now see the surface of the liquid inside the basin. It was clear and still, and on it there floated a small oval capsule about the size of a pigeon's egg. That's the eye, in there, Landy said. Can you see it? Yes. So far as we can tell, it is still in perfect condition. It's his right eye, and the plastic container has a lens on it, similar to the one he used in his own spectacles. At this moment he's probably seeing quite as well as he did before. The ceiling isn't much to look at, Mrs. Pearl said. Don't worry about that. We're in the process of working out a whole program to keep him amused, but we don't want to go too quickly at first. Give him a good book? We will. Are you feeling all right, Mrs. Pearl? Yes. Then we'll go forward a little more, shall we? And you'll be able to see the whole thing. He led her forward until they were standing only a couple of yards from the table, and now she could see right down into the basin. There you are, Landy said. That's William. He was far larger than she had imagined he would be, and darker in colour. With all the ridges and creases running over his surface, he reminded her of nothing so much as an enormous pickled walnut. She could see the stubs of the 4 big arteries and the 2 veins coming out from the base of him, and the neat way in which they were joined to the plastic tubes. And with each throb of the heart machine, all the tubes gave a little jerk in unison as the blood was pushed through them. You'll have to lean over, Landy said, and put your pretty face right above the eye. He'll see you then, and you can smile at him and blow him a kiss. If I were you, I'd say a few nice things as well. He won't actually hear them, but I'm sure he'll get the general idea. He hates people blowing kisses at him, Mrs. Pearl said. I'll do it my own way, if you don't mind. She stepped up to the edge of the table, leaned forward until her face was directly over the basin, and looked straight down into William's eye. she whispered. "It's me, Mary." The eye, bright as ever, stared back at her with a peculiar, fixed intensity. "How are you, dear?" she said. The plastic capsule was transparent all the way round, so that the whole of the eyeball was visible. The optic nerve connecting the underside of it to the brain looked like a short length of grey spaghetti. "Are you feeling all right, William?" It was a queer sensation, peering into her husband's eye when there was no face to go with it. All she had to look at was the eye, and she kept staring at it, and gradually it grew bigger and bigger, and in the end it was the only thing that she could see, a sort of face in itself. There was a network of tiny red veins running over the white surface of the eyeball, and in the ice blue of the iris there were 3 or 4 rather pretty darkish streaks radiating from the pupil in the centre. The pupil was large and black, with a little spark of light reflecting from one side of it. "I got your letter, dear, and came over at once to see how you were. Dr. Landy says you're doing wonderfully well. Perhaps if I talk slowly, you can understand a little of what I'm saying by reading my lips." There was no doubt that the eye was watching her. "They're doing everything possible to take care of you, dear. This marvellous machine thing here is pumping away all the time, and I'm sure it's a lot better than those silly old hearts all the rest of us have. Ours are liable to break down at any moment, but yours will go on forever." She was studying the eye closely, trying to discover what there was about it that gave it such an unusual appearance. "You seem fine, dear. Simply fine. Really you do." It looked ever so much nicer, this eye, than either of his eyes used to look, she told herself. There was a softness about it somewhere, a calm, kindly quality that she'd never seen before. Maybe it had to do with the dot in the very centre, the pupil. William's pupils used always to be tiny black pinheads. They used to glint at you, stabbing into your brain, seeing right through you, and they always knew at once what you were up to, and even what you were thinking. But this one she was looking at now was large and soft and gentle, almost cow-like. "Are you quite sure he's conscious?" she asked, not looking up. "Oh, yes, completely," Landy said. "And he can see me?" "Perfectly." "Isn't that marvellous? I expect he's wondering what happened." "Not at all. He knows perfectly well where he is and why he's there. He can't possibly have forgotten that."
"You mean he knows he's in this basin?"
"Of course. And if only he had the power of speech, he would probably be able to carry on a perfectly normal conversation with you this very minute. So far as I can see, there should be absolutely no difference mentally between this William here and the one you used to know back home."
"Good gracious me," Mrs. Pearl said, and she paused to consider this intriguing aspect. "You know what?" she told herself, looking behind the eye now and staring hard at the great grey, pulpy walnut that lay so placidly under the water. "I'm not at all sure that I don't prefer him as he is at present. In fact, I believe that I could live very comfortably with this kind of a William. I could cope with this one." "Quiet, isn't he?" she said.
"Naturally, he's quiet."
No arguments and criticisms, she thought, no constant admonitions, no rules to obey, no ban on smoking cigarettes, no pair of cold, disapproving eyes watching me over the top of a book in the evenings, no shirts to wash and iron, no meals to cook, nothing but the throb of the heart machine, which was rather a soothing sound anyway, and certainly not loud enough to interfere with television. "Doctor," she said,
I do believe I'm suddenly getting to feel the most enormous affection for him. Does that sound queer?
I think it's quite understandable.
He looks so helpless and silent, lying there under the water in his little basin.
Yes, I know.
He's like a baby. That's what he's like. He's exactly like a little baby.
Landy stood still behind her, watching.
There, she said softly, peering into the basin. From now on, Mary's going to look after you all by herself, and you've nothing to worry about in the world. When can I have him back home, Doctor?
I beg your pardon?
I said, when can I have him back? Back in my own house.
You're joking,
Landy said. She turned her head slowly around and looked directly at him. Why should I joke? She asked. Her face was bright, her eyes round and bright as two diamonds.
You couldn't possibly be moved.
I don't see why not.
This is an experiment, Mrs. Pearl.
It's my husband, Dr. Landy. A funny little nervous half-smile appeared on Landy's mouth.
Well, he said.
It is my husband, you know.
There was no anger in her voice. She spoke quietly, as though merely reminding him of a simple fact. That's rather a tricky point, Landy said, wetting his lips. You're a widow now, Mrs. Pearl. I think you must resign yourself to that fact.
She turned away suddenly from the table and crossed over to the window. I mean it, she said, fishing in her bag for a cigarette. I want him back.
Landy watched her as she put the cigarette between her lips and lit it. Unless he were very much mistaken, there was something a bit odd about this woman, he thought. She seemed almost pleased to have her husband over there, in the basin. He tried to imagine what his own feelings would be if it were his wife's brain lying there and her eye staring up at him out of that capsule. He wouldn't like it. "Shall we go back to my room now?" he said. She was standing by the window, apparently quite calm and relaxed, puffing her cigarette. Yes, all right. On her way past the table, she stopped and leant over the basin once more. Mary's leaving now, sweetheart, she said. And don't you worry about a single thing, you understand? We're going to get you right back home where we can look after you properly, just as soon as we possibly can. And listen, dear. At this point, she paused and carried the cigarette to her lips, intending to take a puff. Instantly, the eye flashed. She was looking straight into it at the time, and right in the centre of it she saw a tiny but brilliant flash of light, and the pupil contracted into a minute black pinpoint of absolute fury. At first, she didn't move. She stood bending over the basin, holding the cigarette up to her mouth, watching the eye. Then, very slowly, deliberately, she put the cigarette between her lips and took a long suck. She inhaled deeply, and she held the smoke inside her lungs for 3 or 4 seconds. Then suddenly, whoosh, out it came through her nostrils in 2 thin jets, which struck the water in the basin and billowed out over the surface in a thick blue cloud, enveloping the eye. Landy was over by the door, with his back to her, waiting. "Come on, Mrs. Pearl," he called. "Don't look so cross, William," she said softly. "It isn't any good looking cross." Landy turned his head to see what she was doing. "Not any more, it isn't," she whispered. "Because from now on, my pet, you're going to do just exactly what Mary tells you. Do you understand that?" "Mrs. Pearl," Landy said, moving towards her. "So don't be a naughty boy again, will you, my precious?" she said, taking another pull at the cigarette. "Naughty boys are liable to get punished most severely nowadays. You ought to know that." Landy was beside her now, and he took her by the arm and began drawing her firmly but gently away from the table. "Goodbye, darling," she called. "I'll be back soon."
That's enough, Mrs. Pearl.
"Isn't he sweet?" she cried, looking up at Landy with big, bright eyes. "Isn't he heaven? I just can't wait to get him home."
Mr. Hoddy. Read by Jessica Hines.
They got out of the car and went in the front door of Mr. Hoddy's house. "I've an idea Dad's going to question you rather sharp tonight," Clarice whispered. "About what, Clarice?" "The usual stuff, jobs and things like that, and whether you can support me in a fitting way." "Jackie's going to do that," Claude said. "When Jackie wins, there won't be any need for any jobs." "Don't you ever mention Jackie to my dad, Claude Cubbage, or that'll be the end of it. If there's one thing in the world he can't abide, it's greyhounds. Don't you ever forget that." "Oh, Christ," Claude said. "Tell him something else. Anything to make him happy. See?" And with that, she led Claude into the parlour. Mr. Hoddy was a widower, a man with a prim, sour mouth, and an expression of eternal disapproval all over his face. He had the small, close-together teeth of his daughter Clarice, the same suspicious, inward look about the eyes, but none of her freshness and vitality, none of her warmth. He was a small, sour apple of a man, grey-skinned and shrivelled, with a dozen or so surviving strands of black hair pasted across the dome of his bald head. But a very superior man was Mr. Hoddy, a grocer's assistant, one who wore a spotless white gown at his work, who handled large quantities of such precious commodities as butter and sugar, who was deferred to, even smiled at, by every housewife in the village. Claude Cubbage was never quite at his ease in this house, and that was precisely as Mr. Hoddy intended it. They were sitting round the fire in the parlour with cups of tea in their hands. Mr. Hoddy in the best chair, to the right of the fireplace, Claude and Clarice on the sofa, decorously separated by a wide space. The younger daughter, Ada, was on a hard, upright chair to the left, and they made a little circle round the fire. A stiff, tense little circle, primly tea-sipping.
"Yes, Mr. Hoddy," Claude was saying. "You can be quite sure both Gordon and me's got a number of nice little ideas up our sleeves this very moment. It's only a question of taking our time and making sure which is going to be the most profitable."
"What sort of ideas?" Mr. Hoddy asked, fixing Claude with his small, disapproving eyes.
"Ah, there you are now, that's it, you see." Claude shifted uncomfortably on the sofa.
His blue lounge suit was tight around his chest, and it was especially tight between his legs up in the crutch. The tightness in his crutch was actually painful to him, and he wanted terribly to hitch it downward. "This man you call Gordon, I thought you had a profitable business out there as it is," Mr. Hoddy said. "Why does he want to change?"
"Absolutely right, Mr. Hoddy. It's a first-rate business. But it's a good thing to keep expanding. See, new ideas is what we're after, something I can come in on as well and take a share of the profits."
"Such as what?" Mr. Hoddy was eating a slice of currant cake, nibbling it round the edges, and his small mouth was like the mouth of a caterpillar biting a tiny curved slice out of the edge of a leaf. "Such as what?" he asked again.
"There's long conferences," Mr. Hoddy, takes place every day between Gordon and me about these different matters of business. Such as what? He repeated, relentless. Clarice glanced sideways at Claude, encouraging. Claude turned his large, slow eyes upon Mr. Hoddy, and he was silent. He wished Mr. Hoddy wouldn't push him around like this, always shooting questions at him and glaring at him and acting just exactly like he was the bloody adjutant or something. Such as what? Mr. Hoddy said, and this time Claude knew that he was not going to let go. Also, his instinct warned him that the old man was trying to create a crisis. Well, now, he said, breathing deep. I don't really want to go into details until we got it properly worked out. All we're doing so far is turning our ideas over in our minds, see? All I'm asking, Mr. Hoddy said irritably, is what sort of business are you contemplating? I presume that it's respectable. Now, please, Mr. Hoddy, you don't for one moment think we'd even so much as consider anything that wasn't absolutely and entirely respectable, do you? Mr. Hoddy grunted, stirring his tea slowly, watching Claude. Clarice sat mute and fearful on the sofa, gazing into the fire. I've never been in favour of starting a business, Mr. Hoddy pronounced, defending his own failure in that line. A good, respectable job is all a man should wish for. A respectable job in respectable surroundings. Too much hokey-pokey in business, for my liking. The thing is this, Claude said, desperate now. All I want is to provide my wife with everything she can possibly desire. A house to live in, and furniture, and a flower garden, and a washing machine, and all the best things in the world. That's what I want to do, and you can't do that on an ordinary wage now, can you? It's impossible to get enough money to do that unless you go into business, Mr. Hoddy. You'll surely agree with me there. Mr. Hoddy, who had worked for an ordinary wage all his life, didn't much like this point of view. And don't you think I provide everything my family wants, might I ask? Oh, yes, and more, Claude cried fervently, but you've got a very superior job, Mr. Hoddy, and that makes all the difference. But what sort of business are you thinking of? The man persisted. Claude sipped his tea to give himself a little more time, and he couldn't help wondering how the miserable old bastard's face would look if he simply up and told him the truth right there and then. If he said, what we've got, Mr. Hoddy, if he really wants to know, is a couple of greyhounds, and one's a perfect ringer for the other, and we're going to bring off the biggest goddamn gamble in the history of flapping, see? He'd like to watch the old bastard's face if he said that, he really would. They were all waiting for him to proceed now, sitting there with cups of tea in their hands, staring at him and waiting for him to say something good. Well, he said, speaking very slowly, because he was thinking deep. I've been pondering something a long time now. Something as'll make more money even than Gordon's second-hand cars, or anything else, come to that, and practically no expense involved. That's better, he told himself. Keep going along like that. And what might that be? Something so queer, Mr. Hoddy. There isn't one in a million would even believe it. Well, what is it? Mr. Hoddy placed his cup carefully on the little table beside him and leaned forward to listen. And Claude, watching him, knew more than ever that this man and all those like him were his enemies. It was the Mr. Hoddys were the trouble. They were all the same. He knew them all, with their clean, ugly hands, their grey skin, their acrid mouths,
the tendency to develop little round, bulging bellies just below the waistcoat, and always the unctuous curl of the nose, the weak chin, the suspicious eyes that were dark and moved too quick. The Mr. Hoddys. Oh, Christ. Well, what is it? It's an absolute goldmine, Mr. Hoddy. Honestly, it is. I'll believe that when I hear it. It's a thing so simple and amazing, most people wouldn't even bother to do it. He had it now. Something he had actually been thinking seriously about for a long time. Something he'd always wanted to do. He leaned across and put his teacup carefully on the table beside Mr. Hoddy's, then, not knowing what to do with his hands, placed them on his knees, palms downward. Well, come on, man. What is it? It's maggots, Claude answered softly. Mr. Hoddy jerked back as though someone had squirted water in his face. Maggots? He said, aghast. Maggots? What on earth do you mean, maggots? Claude had forgotten that this word was almost unmentionable in any self-respecting grocer's shop. Ada began to giggle, but Clarice glanced at her so malignantly the giggle died on her mouth. That's where the money is. Starting a maggot factory. Are you trying to be funny? Honestly, Mr. Hoddy, it may sound a bit queer, and that's simply because you've never heard it before, but it's a little gold mine. A maggot factory? Really now, Cubbage, please be sensible. Clarice wished her father wouldn't call him Cubbage. You never heard speak of a maggot factory, Mr. Hoddy? I certainly have not. There's maggot factories going now. Real big companies with managers and directors and all, and you know what, Mr. Hoddy? They're making millions. Nonsense, man. And you know why they're making millions? Claude paused, but he did not notice now that his listener's face was slowly turning yellow. It's because of the enormous demand for maggots, Mr. Hoddy. At that moment, Mr. Hoddy was listening also to other voices. The voices of his customers across the counter. Mrs. Rabbit's, for instance, as he sliced off her ration of butter. Mrs. Rabbit, with her brown moustache and always talking so loud and saying, well, well, well. He could hear her now saying, well, 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 Mr. Hoddy, so your Clarice got married last week, did she? Very nice too, I must say. And what was it you said her husband does, Mr. Hoddy? He owns a maggot factory, Mrs. Rabbit's. No, thank you, he told himself, watching Claude with his small, hostile eyes. No, thank you very much indeed, I don't want that. I can't say, he announced primly, that I, myself, have ever had occasion to purchase a maggot. Now you come to mention it, Mr. Hoddy, nor have I, nor as many other people we know, but let me ask you something else. How many times you had occasion to purchase a crown, wheel and pinion, for instance? This was a shrewd question, and Claude permitted himself a slow, mawkish smile. What's that got to do with maggots? Exactly this, that certain people buy certain things, see? You never bought a crown, wheel and pinion in your life, but that don't say there isn't men getting rich this very moment making 'em, because there is. It's the same with maggots. Would you mind telling me who these unpleasant people are who buy maggots? Maggots are bought by fishermen, Mr. Hoddy. Amateur fishermen. There's thousands and thousands of fishermen all over the country going out every weekend fishing the rivers, and all of them wanting maggots. Willing to pay good money for them too. You go along the river there, anywhere you like above Marlow on a Sunday, and you'll see them lying in the banks, sitting there, one beside the other, simply lying in the banks on both sides. Those men don't buy maggots. They go down the bottom of the garden and dig worms.
Now that's just where you're wrong, Mr. Hoddy, if you'll allow me to say so. That's just where you're absolutely wrong. They want maggots, not worms. In that case, they get their own maggots. They don't want to get their own maggots. Just imagine, Mr. Hoddy. It's Saturday afternoon. You're going out fishing, and a nice clean tin of maggots arrives by post, and all you've got to do is slip it in the fishing bag and away you go. You don't think fellers is going to go out digging for worms and hunting for maggots where they can have them delivered right to their very doorsteps like that, just for a bob or two, do you? And might I ask how you propose to run this maggot factory of yours? When he spoke the word maggot, it seemed as if he was spitting out a sour little pip from his mouth. Easiest thing in the world to run a maggot factory. Claude was gaining confidence now, and warming to his subject. All you need is a couple of old oil drums and a few lumps of rotten meat or sheep's head, and you put them in the oil drums, and that's all you do. Flies do the rest. Had he been watching Mr. Hoddy's face, he probably would have stopped there. Of course, it's not quite as easy as it sounds. What you've got to do next is feed up your maggots with special diet, bran and milk. And then when they get big and fat, you put them in pint tins and post them off to your customers. 5 shillings a pint they fetch. 5 shillings a pint, he cried, slapping the knee. Just imagine that, Mr. Hoddy. And they say one blue bottle will lay 20 pints easy. He paused again, but merely to marshal his thoughts, for there was no stopping him now. And there's another thing, Mr. Hoddy. A good maggot factory don't just breed ordinary maggots, you know. Every fisherman's got his own tastes. Maggots are commonest, but also there's lugworms. Some fishermen won't have nothing but lugworms. And of course there's coloured maggots. Ordinary maggots are white, but you get them all sorts of different colours by feeding them special food, see? Red ones and green ones and black ones, and you can even get blue ones if you knew what to feed them. The most difficult thing of all in a maggot factory is a blue maggot, Mr. Hoddy. Claude stopped to catch his breath. He was having a vision now, the same vision that accompanied all his dreams of wealth, of an immense factory building with tall chimneys and hundreds of happy workers streaming in through the wide wrought-iron gates, and Claude himself sitting in his luxurious office, directing operations with a calm and splendid assurance. There's people with brains studying these things this very minute, he went on. So you got to jump in quick, unless you want to get left out in the cold. That's the secret of big business, jumping in quick before all the others, Mr. Hoddy. Clarice, Ada, and the father sat absolutely still, looking straight ahead. None of them moved or spoke. Only Claude rushed on. Just so long as you make sure your maggots is alive when you post them. They've got to be wiggling, see? Maggots is no good unless they're wiggling. And when we really get going, when we built up a little capital, then we'll put up some glass houses. Another pause, and Claude stroked his chin. Now, I expect you're all wondering why a person should want glass houses in a maggot factory. Well, I'll tell you. It's for the flies in the winter, see? Most important to take care of your flies in the winter. I think that's enough, thank you, Cubbage, Mr. Hoddy said suddenly. Claude looked up, and for the first time he saw the expression on the man's face. It stopped him cold. I don't want to hear any more about it, Mr. Hoddy said. All I'm trying to do, Mr. Hoddy, Claude cried, is give your little girl everything she can possibly desire. That's all I'm thinking of, night and day, Mr. Hoddy. Then all I hope is you'll be able to do it without the help of maggots. Dad, Clarice cried, alarmed. I simply won't have you talking to Claude like that. I'll talk to him how I wish, thank you, miss. I think it's time I was getting along, Claude said. Good night.
The Princess and the Poacher. Although Hengist was now 18 years old, he still showed no desire to follow in his father's trade of basket weaving. He even refused to go out and collect the osiers from the riverbank. This saddened his parents greatly, but they were wise enough to know that it seldom pays to force a young lad to work at something when his heart is not in it. In appearance, Hengist was an exceedingly unattractive youth. With his squat body, his short bandy legs, his extra-long arms, and his crumpled face, he looked almost as though there might be a touch of the ape or the gorilla about him. He was certainly mighty strong. He could bend double a 2-inch thick iron bar with his hands alone, and once he had astonished an old carter whose horse had fallen into a ditch by lifting the animal out bodily in his arms and placing it back on the road. Quite naturally, Hengist was interested in maidens fair, but, as one might expect, no maidens, fair or otherwise, were interested in Hengist. He was a pleasant enough fellow, there was no doubt about that, but there is a limit to the degree of ugliness any woman can tolerate in a man. Hengist was well beyond that limit. In fact, his ugliness was so extreme that no female other than his mother would have anything to do with him. This was a great sorrow to the lad. It was also grossly unfair because no man is responsible for his own looks. Poor Hengist. Although he knew that every maid and every wench in the kingdom was far beyond his reach forever, he continued to long for them and lust after them with unabated passion. Whenever he spied a girl milking a cow or hanging out the washing, he would stop and stare and yearn most terribly to possess her. Fortunately for him, he was soon to find another outlet for his energies. It had become a habit of his to take long walks in the countryside through the forests and the glens, to cool his ardour, and over the ensuing weeks he began in some subtle way to fall in love with the landscape of the open air. He would spend his days roaming in deserted places, a silent, solitary, terribly uncouth figure, communing with nature. And thus, gradually and inevitably, he came to learn a great deal about the habits of animals and birds. He also discovered to his delight that he possessed the ability to move so silently through the forest that he could come within arm's length of a timid creature like a hare or a deer before it was aware of his presence. This was not just from practice. It appeared to be a gift that had been bestowed upon him, a rare ability to merge into the landscape and suddenly to emerge again, almost like a ghost, when no man or bird or beast had seen him coming. His family were very poor, and they hardly ever tasted meat or game from one year to the next. Quite understandably, and quite soon, it dawned upon Hengist that he could very easily improve their lot, and indeed his own, by doing a little poaching. He began slowly with a rabbit or a partridge once a week, but it was not long before the sheer pleasure and excitement of the chase took hold of him. Here, after all, was something he could do extraordinarily well. Poaching was an art. The thrill of creeping up on a crouching hare undetected, or of snatching a roosting pheasant from a branch, gave him a sense of satisfaction such as he had never known before. He became addicted to the sport. But poaching was a hazardous occupation in the kingdom. All the land, all the forests and the streams were owned either by the king himself or by one of the great dukes, and although the footpaths on their estates were open to the public for strolling quietly, poaching on these lands was strictly forbidden. Anyone who strayed off the designated footpaths did so at his peril. The undergrowth was strewn with cunningly concealed man-traps whose iron jaws could bite a man's leg to the bone if he stepped on the plate that released the spring, and there the poor captive would remain, pinned to the ground, until a patrolling keeper found him the next day. In the eyes of the king and the dukes, poaching was a greater crime than murder. The sentence for murder was simply death by hanging, but the sentence for poaching was far more unpleasant. A convicted poacher would first be weighed on a special balance. Then 2 leaden anklets would be constructed whose weight had been most carefully calculated by the royal mathematician. These anklets would be fastened around the victim's ankles and his hands tied behind his back before he was lowered into the great drowning tub that was built of stone and stood permanently in the market square of the capital. The man's height had also been measured beforehand by the mathematician, and a quantity of water had either been added to or taken out of the tub so that when the man stood on tiptoe on the bottom, the top of his head was just below the surface of the water. The result of all this was that the victim spent many hours, sometimes days, being pulled down by the weight of the anklets, then jumping up again for a quick breath of air when his feet touched the bottom. Finally, he sank altogether from exhaustion. The uncomfortable nature of this punishment did much to discourage the population from breaking the law of the land. The hunting of game was the prerogative only of the royal family and the dukes. But Hengist was not to be intimidated. He had such faith in his powers of stealth that he harboured no fears of the dreaded drowning tub. His parents were, of course, frightened out of their skins. Every evening when he went out and every dawn when he returned with a juicy partridge or a leveret under his coat, they trembled for their son, and indeed for themselves. But hunger is a powerful persuader, and the spoils were always accepted and roasted and devoured with relish. "You are being careful, son, are you not?" the mother would say as she munched upon the tender breast of a woodcock. "I is always careful, ma," Hengist would answer. "That little old king, them fancy dukes, they ain't never going to lay a finger on me." Hengist soon became so confident in his powers of poaching that he scorned the cover of darkness and took to going out in full daylight, which was something that only the bravest or the most foolhardy would do. And then one day, on a fine morning in springtime, he decided to have a go at the most protected area in the entire kingdom, that part of the royal forest which lies immediately beneath the walls of the castle itself, where the king lived. Here the game was more plentiful than anywhere else, but the dangers were tremendous. Hengist, as he crept soft and silent into the royal forest, was relishing this danger. And now he was standing immobile in the shadow of a mighty beech, watching a young roebuck grazing not 5 paces away, and waiting for the moment to pounce. Out of the edge of one eye he could see the south wall of the royal castle itself, and somewhere in the distance he could hear bugles blowing. They were probably changing the guard at the gates, he told himself. Then suddenly, out of that same eye, he caught sight of a figure among the trees not 40 paces distant. Slowly, he turned his head to examine this person more carefully, and, lo and behold, he saw immediately that it was none other than the young princess, the only child of the king and the jewel in his crown. She was a young damsel of breathtaking beauty, with skin as pure and smooth as a silken glove, and she was but 17 years old. Here she was then, apparently idling away the morning picking bluebells in the wood. Hengist's heart gave a jump when he saw her, and all the old passions came flooding back once again. For a mad moment or two he considered surprising the damsel by kneeling before her with whispered words of love and adoration, but he knew only too well what would happen then. She would take one look at his terrible ugliness and run away screaming, and he would be caught and put to death. It also occurred to him that he might creep upon her stealthily, coming up behind her unseen, then clapping a hand over her mouth and having his way with her by force. But he quickly pushed this foul notion out of his mind, for he abhorred violence of any kind. What happened next came very suddenly. There was a fanfare of hunting horns nearby, and Hengist turned and saw a massive wild boar, the largest he had ever seen, come charging through the trees, and behind it, some 50 paces back, was riding the king himself and a group of noblemen, all galloping full tilt after the boar with lances drawn. The princess was right in the path of the running boar, and the boar was in no mood to swerve around her. Just the opposite. An angry hunted boar will attack any human who stands in its line of flight. Worse still, it will often swing aside and attack an innocent bystander who might happen to be near. And now the boar had spotted the princess, and it was making straight for her. Hengist saw the maiden drop her bunch of bluebells and run. Then she seemed to realize the futility of this, and she stopped and pressed herself against the trunk of a giant oak, and there she stood, helpless, with arms outspread as though for crucifixion, waiting for the madly rushing beast to reach her. Hengist saw the boar, the size of a small bull, charging forwards with head down, the 2 sharp glistening tusks pointing straight at the victim. He took off like an arrow. He flew over the ground with his feet hardly touching the earth, and when he realized that the boar was going to reach the princess before him, he made a last, despairing dive through the air, and reached far out with his hands, and just managed to grab hold of the boar's tusks when they were within a fraction of the maiden's midriff. Both Hengist and the boar went tumbling over in a heap, but the youth held on to the tusks, and when he leapt to his feet again, the boar came with him, lifted on high by the strongest pair of arms in the kingdom. Hengist gave a sudden twist with his hands, and even the king, some 30 paces distant, heard the boar's cervical spine snap in two. Hengist then swung the massive beast back and forth a couple of times before sending it sailing over his head as easily as if it had been a stick of firewood. The king reached them first, galloping like mad and reining in his frothing horse right beside his daughter. He was followed by half a dozen noblemen who all pulled up behind the king. The king leapt from his charger, crying out, "My darling, my little child, are you all right?" He'd witnessed the whole of the 4-second drama, and in truth, when he had seen the boar charging straight for his daughter, he thought she was finished. And then he had seen this extraordinary human arrow leaping and flying between the trees and flinging himself upon the terrible boar just in the nick of time. The king was white in the face as he took the sobbing princess in his arms to console her. Hengist stood awkwardly by, not quite knowing what to do with his hands or his feet or anything else. At last the king turned to look at Hengist. For a moment or two the shock of seeing such a spectacularly ugly youth rendered him speechless. But he kept on looking, and as he looked he found himself liking more and more what he saw. A man is seldom repelled by the malformed features of another man. Quite the reverse. Men as a whole take less kindly to other men who are exceptionally good-looking. Women are often the same with other women. Yet, as we all know, good looks do have a profound influence upon the opposite sex. This is a fact of life, but as the wise king knew, it caused much disillusionment later on. Yes, the king was telling himself as he continued to stare at this curious fellow who stood before him, how different he is from the sloppy, effeminate, lecherous young courtiers who surround me at the castle. This is a real man. He is brave and swift and fearless, and to hell with his looks. It was at this point that a sly plot began to hatch in the king's devious mind. In his rich, royal voice charged with emotion, he said, "Young man, today you have done me the greatest service any citizen could perform for his king. You have saved the treasure of my life, the pearl of my kingdom, my only child. Indeed, the only child I shall ever have because the poor queen is dead. I intend to see that you are rewarded in a munificent manner. Pray accompany me to the castle at once." Then the king lifted the princess up onto his charger and himself got into the saddle behind her. The entourage rode off at a trot, with a rather bemused Hengist running alongside. As soon as he arrived at the castle, the king summoned a meeting of the elders. Ostensibly, these old men were the parliament that ruled the kingdom, but in reality it was the king himself who decided everything. No man dared gainsay the monarch. In the council chamber, the elders, 20 in all, were assembled in their pews. Above, on a dais, sat the king upon his throne, and beside him stood Hengist. The latter was not very suitably attired for the occasion. He wore a shirt made from some kind of sacking, his breeches were filthy, and on his stockingless feet was a pair of homemade sandals. The elders stared at this ugly, ill-dressed creature with distaste. The king smiled. He was a curious man, the king, much given to eccentricities and japes and ingenious practical jokes. For example, at his dining table, which seated 12 guests, he had 12 little taps concealed under the edge of the table, and if any of his guests, male or female, annoyed him or said something foolish, the king would reach under the table and open the appropriate tap. This would send a powerful jet of water from a tiny hole in the centre of the chair right up the backside of the offending guest. It had not taken the king long to realise that Hengist, with those terribly ugly features, must be the most sexually disappointed man in the kingdom. He had actually observed several ladies of the court recoiling and covering their faces as the youth passed by. All this suited his subtle plan very well. "Learned elders," he said, addressing the council, "this gallant youth, Hengist by name, has by an act of unbelievable bravery saved the life of the princess, your future queen. No reward is too great for him. He shall therefore be granted a stipend of 1,000 gold crowns a year, and shall be accommodated in a grace and favour mansion on the royal estate. He shall be provided with servants and a lavish wardrobe, and whatever else he desires for his comfort. "Hear, hear," the elders murmured. "He well deserves it. But that is a mere nothing compared with other favours I am now about to grant him," the king went on. "I have decided that the greatest reward I can bestow upon this valiant and gallant youth is as follows. By royal decree, he shall also be granted—" Here the king paused dramatically. The elders waited. "He shall be granted the absolute right to ravish any maiden, wench, lady, dame, countess, duchess, or other female in the kingdom whenever he so desires." There was uproar among the elders. "You can't do that," they cried. "What about our wives? What about our daughters?" "What about them?" the king asked. "You'll notice that I have not even excluded the princess. So why should I exclude your wretched wives and daughters?" "You mustn't do this, your majesty," the elders cried out. "There will be chaos at court. There will be rape in the corridors. The whole place will be bedlam. Our poor innocent daughters, our dear wives." "I doubt your daughters or wives will qualify," the king remarked dryly. "Only great beauties will stand a chance of being noticed. When a man has his pick, he chooses carefully." "We beg you, majesty," the elders cried, "do not force us to pass such a law." "Nothing you say will deter me," said the king. "And furthermore, I decree that any lady who refuses to submit to the blandishments of Count Hengist— I have just made him a count, by the way— will be put to death in the drowning tub." The elders were all on their feet, waving their order papers and shouting against the king. "You've gone too far," they cried. "There will be sexual anarchy in the land." "Don't be so sure," said the clever king. "Sexual anarchy," the elders chanted. "Rape on the ramparts. It's not good enough." "Listen," said the king, beginning to lose patience. "I'll have the whole lot of you put in the drowning tub if you give me any more trouble." That shut them up. "Lastly," the king continued, "and you'd better note this carefully, any man, any father or husband or brother who attempts to interfere with the noble count in the pursuance of his desires shall also be put in the drowning tub. Do I make myself clear?" There was a steely edge to the king's voice, and the elders sat down and remained silent and sulked. They knew that their ruler, who had the entire army behind him to a man, was all-powerful. He always got his way. "Draw up the proclamation immediately," the king said. "Have it posted in towns and villages all over the kingdom. Have the town criers call out the news in every hamlet. Tell the population that Count Hengist enjoys the freedom of all the women in the realm. And be sure to stress the penalties for disobedience. See also that Count Hengist himself be given a card of authority, that he can wave in the face of any maiden or wench he may desire." Thus this extraordinary decree was made law, and Hengist, under the full protection of the king, moved into a mansion near the castle where servants bathed him and groomed him and taught him how to dress in the style of the court. At first the poor fellow was totally bewildered. He wandered awkwardly about the court, shunned by everybody. The dukes snubbed him or ignored him. The ladies ran for their lives whenever he hove in sight, and who could blame them? Not even the most lascivious courtesans wanted to go near the poor fellow. He was treated by one and all as though he had leprosy. But a strange thing had happened to Hengist. His desires seemed suddenly to have evaporated. He knew all about the immense powers he possessed. He was aware that he had the full backing of the king. He could seek out and ravish any maiden he desired, not only at court, but in the towns and villages all over the country. The trouble was, he did not desire them. He felt no urge at all. It was the old story of the forbidden fruit. Make it easy to get, and the appetite goes away. The king, who had been watching all this for several weeks with wry amusement, was strolling one morning on the ramparts with the princess, when suddenly Hengist happened by. "How goes it, my lad?" said the king, slapping the youth on the back. "Your Majesty," Hengist said, "to tell the truth, I doesn't much care for this thing you has done to me. "My dear chap," said the king, "what on earth is the trouble?" "Well, nobody likes me round here. Angus said they's all treating me like dirt." "I like you," said the princess suddenly. Hengist stared at her. "You does," he said. "You are the only man in the castle who does not chase me along the corridors," the princess said. "You are the only decent person in the whole place." "Now I come to think of it, my darling," said the king, smiling a little, "I suppose you're right." "I know I'm right, Daddy," the young beauty said. "All the other men around here are totally disgusting. I hate them." "Some of them are very handsome, my dear," the king said. "That's got nothing to do with it," cried the princess. "I don't give a fig about looks." "You mean you likes me a little bit?" Hengist inquired nervously. "Like you?" cried the princess, flinging herself into his arms. "I love you." The king slipped away, leaving them alone. He was well pleased with the way things had worked out.
Genesis and Catastrophe.
A true story. "Everything's normal," the doctor was saying. "Just lie back and relax." His voice was miles away in the distance, and he seemed to be shouting at her. "You have a son." "What?" "You have a fine son. You understand that, don't you? A fine son. Did you hear him crying?" "Is he all right, Doctor?" "Of course he's all right." "Please, let me see him." "You'll see him in a moment." "You're certain he's all right?" "I'm quite certain." "Is he still crying?" "Try to rest. There's nothing to worry about." "Why's he stopped crying, Doctor? What happened?" "Don't excite yourself, please. Everything's normal."
"I want to see him. Please, let me see him."
"Dear lady," the doctor said, patting her hand, "you have a fine, strong, healthy child. Don't you believe me when I tell you that?"
"What's the woman over there doing to him?"
"Your baby is being made to look pretty for you," the doctor said. "We're giving him a little wash, that's all. You must spare us a moment or two for that."
"You swear he's all right?"
"I swear it. Now lie back and relax. Close your eyes. Go on, close your eyes. That's right, that's better. Good girl."
"I've prayed and prayed that he will live, Doctor."
"Of course he'll live. What are you talking about?"
"The others didn't."
"What?"
"None of my other ones lived, Doctor."
The doctor stood beside the bed, looking down at the pale, exhausted face of the young woman. He had never seen her before today. She and her husband were new people in the town. The innkeeper's wife, who'd come up to assist in the delivery, had told him that the husband worked at the local customs house on the border, and that the two of them had arrived quite suddenly at the inn with one trunk and one suitcase about 3 months ago. The husband was a drunkard, the innkeeper's wife had said, an arrogant, overbearing, bullying little drunkard. But the young woman was gentle and religious. And she was very sad. She never smiled. In the few weeks that she had been here, the innkeeper's wife had never once seen her smile. Also, there was a rumour that this was the husband's 3rd marriage, that one wife had died and that the other had divorced him for unsavoury reasons. But that was only a rumour. The doctor bent down and pulled the sheet up a little higher over the patient's chest. "You have nothing to worry about," he said gently. "This is a perfectly normal baby."
"That's exactly what they told me about the others. But I lost them all, Doctor. In the last 18 months, I've lost all 3 of my children, so you mustn't blame me for being anxious."
3?
"This is my 4th, in 4 years."
The doctor shifted his feet uneasily on the bare floor.
"I don't think you know what it means, Doctor, to lose them all 3 of them, slowly, separately, one by one. I keep seeing them. I can see Gustav's face now as clearly as if he were lying here beside me on the bed. Gustav was a lovely boy, Doctor, but he was always ill. It is terrible when they're always ill and there's nothing you can do to help them.
I know. The woman opened her eyes, stared up at the doctor for a few seconds, then closed them again.
My little girl was called Ida. She died a few days before Christmas. That's only 4 months ago. I just wish you could have seen Ida, Doctor.
You have a new one now?
But Ida was so beautiful.
Yes, the doctor said. I know.
How can you know?
She cried. I'm sure that she was a lovely child, but this new one is also like that. The doctor turned away from the bed and walked over to the window and stood there looking out. It was a wet, grey April afternoon, and across the street he could see the red roofs of the houses and the huge raindrops splashing on the tiles.
Ida was 2 years old, Doctor, and she was so beautiful. I was never able to take my eyes off her from the time I dressed her in the morning until she was safe in bed again at night. I used to live in holy terror of something happening to that child. Gustav had gone, and my little Otto had also gone, and she was all I had left. Sometimes I used to get up in the night and creep over to the cradle and put my ear close to her mouth just to make sure that she was breathing.
Try to rest, the doctor said, going back to the bed. Please try to rest. The woman's face was white and bloodless, and there was a slight bluish-grey tinge around the nostrils and the mouth. A few strands of damp hair hung down over her forehead, sticking to the skin.
When she died, I was already pregnant again when that happened, Doctor. This new one was a good 4 months on its way when Ida died. I don't want it! I shouted after the funeral. I won't have it! I've buried enough children! And my husband, he was strolling among the guests with a big glass of beer in his hand. And he turned round quickly and said, I have news for you, Clara. I've good news. Can you imagine that, Doctor? We've just buried our 3rd child, and he stands there with a glass of beer in his hand and tells me that he has good news. Today I've been posted to Braunau, he says, so you can start packing at once. This'll be a new start for you, Clara. He says it'll be a new place and you can have a new doctor.
Please don't talk any more.
You are the new doctor, aren't you, Doctor?
That's right.
And here we are, in Braunau?
Yes.
I'm frightened, Doctor.
Try not to be frightened.
What chance can the 4th one have now?
You must stop thinking like that.
I can't help it. I'm certain there is something inherited that causes my children to die in this way. There must be.
That is nonsense.
Do you know what my husband said to me when Otto was born, Doctor? He came into the room and he looked into the cradle where Otto was lying, and he said, Why do all my children have to be so small and weak?
I'm sure he didn't say that.
He put his head right into Otto's cradle as though he were examining a tiny insect, and he said, All I'm saying is why can't there be better specimens? That's all I'm saying. And 3 days after that, Otto was dead. We baptized him quickly on the 3rd day, and he died the same evening. And then Gustav died. And then Ida died. All of them died, Doctor, and suddenly the whole house was empty.
Don't think about it now.
Is this one so very small?
He's a normal child.
But small? He is a little small, perhaps, but the small ones are often a lot tougher than the big ones. Just imagine, Frau Hitler, this time next year he will be almost learning how to walk. Isn't that a lovely thought? She didn't answer this. And 2 years from now he will probably be talking his head off and driving you crazy with his chatter. Have you settled on a name for him yet?
A name?
Yes.
I don't know. I'm not sure. I think my husband said that if it was a boy, we were going to call him Adolphus.
Oh, that means he would be called Adolf.
Yes, my husband likes Adolf because it has a certain similarity to Alois. My husband is called Alois.
Excellent.
Oh, no, she cried, starting up suddenly from the pillow. That's the same question they asked me when Otto was born. It means he's going to die. You're going to baptize him at once.
Now, the doctor said, taking her gently by the shoulders. You're quite wrong. I promise you, you are wrong. I was simply being an inquisitive old man, that's all. I love talking about names. I think Adolphus is a particularly fine name. It is one of my favourites. And look, here he comes now.
The innkeeper's wife, carrying the baby high up on her enormous bosom, came sailing across the room towards the bed.
"Here's the little beauty," she cried, beaming. "Would you like to hold him, my dear? Shall I put him beside you?" "Is he well wrapped?" the doctor asked. "It's extremely cold in here." "Certainly he's well wrapped."
The baby was tightly swaddled in a white woolen shawl, and only the tiny pink head protruded. The innkeeper's wife placed him gently on the bed beside the mother.
"There you are," she said. "Now you can lie there and look at him to your heart's content." "I think you'll like him," the doctor said, smiling. "He's a fine little baby."
"He has the most lovely hands," the innkeeper's wife exclaimed. "Such long, delicate fingers." The mother didn't move. She didn't even turn her head to look.
"Go on," cried the innkeeper's wife. "He won't bite you."
"I'm frightened to look. I don't dare to believe that I have another baby, and that he's all right."
"Don't be so stupid."
Slowly the mother turned her head and looked at the small, incredibly serene face that lay on the pillow beside her. "Is this my baby?"
"Of course."
Oh, but he's beautiful." The doctor turned away and went over to the table and began putting his things into his bag. The mother lay on the bed, gazing at the child and smiling and touching him and making little noises of pleasure. "Hello, Adolphus," she whispered. "Hello, my little Adolf."
"Shh,"
said the innkeeper's wife.
"Listen, I think your husband's coming."
The doctor walked over to the door and opened it and looked out into the corridor.
"Herr Hitler?" "Yes?"
"Come in, please." A small man in a dark green uniform stepped softly into the room and looked around him.
"Congratulations," the doctor said. "You have a son."
The man had a pair of enormous whiskers, meticulously groomed after the manner of the Emperor Franz Joseph, and he smelled strongly of beer.
"A son?"
"Yes."
"How is he?"
"He's fine. So is your wife."
"Good."
The father turned and walked with a curious little prancing stride over to the bed where his wife was lying.
"Well, Clara?"
he said, smiling through his whiskers.
"How did it go?"
He bent down to take a look at the baby. Then he bent lower. In a series of quick, jerky movements, he bent lower and lower until his face was only about 12 inches from the baby's head. The wife lay sideways on the pillow, staring up at him with a kind of supplicating look. "He has the most marvellous pair of lungs," the innkeeper's wife announced. "You should have heard him screaming just after he came into this world." "But my God, Clara!"
"What is it, dear?"
"This one is even smaller than Otto was." The doctor took a couple of quick paces forward. "There is nothing wrong with that child," he said. Slowly the husband straightened up and turned away from the bed and looked at the doctor. He seemed bewildered and stricken. "It's no good lying, Doctor," he said. "I know what it means. It's going to be the same, all over again." "Now you listen to me," the doctor said. "But do you know what happened to the others, Doctor?" "You must forget about the others, Herr Hitler. Give this one a chance." "But so small and weak." "My dear sir, he's only just been born." "Even so, what are you trying to do?" cried the innkeeper's wife. "Talk him into his grave?" "That's enough," the doctor said sharply. The mother was weeping now. Great sobs were shaking her body. The doctor walked over to the husband and put a hand on his shoulder. "Be good to her," he whispered. "Please, it is very important." Then he squeezed the husband's shoulder hard and began pushing him forward surreptitiously to the edge of the bed. The husband hesitated. The doctor squeezed harder, signalling him urgently through fingers and thumb. At last, reluctantly, the husband bent down and kissed his wife lightly on the cheek. "All right, Clara," he said. "Now stop crying."
"I've prayed so hard that he will live, Alois."
"Yes."
"Every day for months I've gone to the church and begged on my knees that this one will be allowed to live."
"Yes, Clara, I know."
3 dead children is all that I can stand. Don't you realise that?
"Of course."
He must live, Alois. He must. He must. Oh, God, be merciful unto him now."
Fagging. I spent 2 long years as a fag at Repton, which meant I was the servant of the study-holder in whose study I had my little desk. If the study-holder happened to be a house bozer, so much the worse for me, because bozers were a dangerous breed. During my 2nd term, I was unfortunate enough to be put into the study of the head of the house, a supercilious and obnoxious 17-year-old called Carlton. Carlton always looked at you right down the length of his nose, and even if you were as tall as him, which I happened to be, he would tilt his head back and still manage to look at you down the length of his nose. Carlton had 3 fags in his study, and all of us were terrified of him, especially on Sunday mornings, because Sunday was study cleaning time. All the fags in all the studies had to take off their jackets, roll up their sleeves, fetch buckets and floor cloths, and get down to cleaning out their study-holder's study. And when I say cleaning out, I mean practically sterilizing the place. We scrubbed the floor and washed the windows and polished the grate and dusted the ledges and wiped the picture frames and carefully tidied away all the hockey sticks and cricket bats and umbrellas. All that Sunday morning we had been slogging away cleaning Carlton's study, and then, just before lunch, Carlton himself strode into the room and said, "You've had long enough." "Yes, Carlton," the 3 of us murmured, trembling. We stood back, breathless from our exertions, compelled as always to wait and watch the dreadful Carlton while he performed the ritual of inspection. First of all, he would go to the drawer of his desk and take out a pure white cotton glove, which he slid with much ceremony onto his right hand. Then, taking as much care and time as a surgeon in an operating theatre, he would move slowly round the study, running his white-gloved fingers all along the ledges, along the tops of the picture frames, over the surfaces of the desks, and even over the bars of the fire grate. Every few seconds he would hold those white fingers up close to his face, searching for traces of dust, and we 3 fags would stand there watching him, hardly daring to breathe, waiting for the dreaded moment when the great man would stop and shout, "Ha! What's this I see?" A look of triumph would light up his face as he held up a white finger, which had on it the tiniest smudge of grey dust, and he would stare at us with his slightly popping pale blue eyes and say, You haven't cleaned it, have you? You haven't bothered to clean my study properly." To the three of us fags who had been slaving away for the whole of the morning, these words were simply not true. "We've cleaned every bit of it, Carlton," we would answer. "Every little bit." "In that case, why has my finger got dust on it?" Carlton would say, tilting his head back and gazing at us down the length of his nose. "This is dust, isn't it?" We would step forward and peer at the white-gloved forefinger and at the tiny smidgen of dust that lay on it, and we would remain silent. I longed to point out to him that it was an actual impossibility to clean a much-used room to the point where no speck of dust remained, but that would have been suicide. "Do any of you dispute the fact that this is dust?" Carlton would say, still holding up his finger. "If I am wrong, do tell me." "It isn't much dust, Carlton." "I didn't ask you whether it was much dust or not much dust," Carlton would say. "I simply asked you whether or not it was dust. Might it, for example, be iron filings or face powder instead?" "No, Carlton." "Or crushed diamonds, maybe?" "No, Carlton." "Then what is it?" It's dust, Carlton." "Thank you," Carlton would say. "At last you have admitted that you failed to clean my study properly. I shall therefore see all three of you in the changing room tonight after prayers." The rules and rituals of fagging at Repton were so complicated that I could fill a whole book with them. A house bowser, for example, could make any fag in the house do his bidding. He could stand anywhere he wanted to in the building, in the corridor, in the changing room, in the yard, and yell, "Fag!" at the top of his voice, and every fag in the place would have to drop what he was doing and run flat out to the source of the noise. There was always a mad stampede when the call of "fag" echoed through the house, because the last boy to arrive would invariably be chosen for whatever menial or unpleasant task the bowser had in mind. During my first term, I was in the changing room one day just before lunch, scraping the mud from the soles of my study-holder's football boots, when I heard the famous shout of "fag" far away at the other end of the house. I dropped everything and ran. But I got there last, and the bowser who had done the shouting, a massive athlete called Wilberforce, said, "Dahl, come here." The other fags melted away with the speed of light, and I crept forward to receive my orders. "Go and heat my seat in the bogs," Wilberforce said. "I want it warm." I hadn't the faintest idea what any of this meant, but I already knew better than to ask questions of a bowser. I hurried away and found a fellow fag who told me the meaning of this curious order. It meant that the bowser wished to use the lavatory, but that he wanted the seat warmed for him before he sat down. The 6 house lavatories, none with doors, were situated in an unheated outhouse, and on a cold day in winter you could get frostbite out there if you stayed too long. This particular day was icy cold, and I went out through the snow into the outhouse and entered number 1 lavatory, which I knew was reserved for bowsers only. I wiped the frost off the seat with my handkerchief, then I lowered my trousers and sat down. I was there a full 15 minutes in the freezing cold before Wilberforce arrived on the scene. "Have you got the ice off it?" he asked. "Yes, Wilberforce." "Is it warm?" "It's as warm as I can get it, Wilberforce," I said. "We shall soon find out," he said. "You can get off now." I got off the lavatory seat and pulled up my trousers. Wilberforce lowered his own trousers and sat down. "Very good," he said. "Very good indeed." He was like a wine taster sampling an old claret. "I shall put you on my list," he added. I stood there doing up my fly buttons and not knowing what on earth he meant. "Some fags have cold bottoms," he said, "and some have hot ones. I only use hot-bottomed fags to heat my bog seat. I won't forget you." He didn't. From then on, all through that winter, I became Wilberforce's favourite bog seat warmer, and I always used to keep a paperback book in the pocket of my tailcoat to while away the long bog-warming sessions. I must have read the entire works of Dickens sitting on that bowser's bog during my first winter at Repton.